They said it would be an easy victory. Instead, the waters of Tarawa ran red before the first Marines even reached the shore. The Battle of Tarawa was one of the most brutal and shocking clashes of the Pacific War, a battle that compressed all the horrors of amphibious warfare into just 76 hours of unrelenting violence. In November 1943, United States Marines stormed the tiny atoll of Betio in the Tarawa Chain, a strip of sand barely 2 miles long, yet fortified by thousands of Japanese defenders who had sworn to fight to the death. It was the first time in the war that American forces faced heavily fortified Japanese positions head-on in the Central Pacific, and the result was a bloodbath that stunned the home front. Amphibious tractors bogged down on reefs, landing craft stranded men in waist-deep water, and machine guns cut down wave after wave of Marines before they could even reach the beaches. The tropical lagoon, once tranquil and blue, turned crimson with the sacrifice of young men who fought yard by yard against bunkers, pillboxes, and fanatical resistance. Japanese soldiers, deeply entrenched in concrete defenses, unleashed a storm of fire, while American artillery, naval bombardment, and close air support struggled to break the defenders' resolve. For 3 days, the battle raged with a ferocity that left thousands dead on both sides, making Tarawa a symbol of the cost of island warfare. It was a lesson in strategy, in courage, and in the terrible price of victory, one that forced the United States to rethink amphibious tactics as it pushed across the Pacific toward Japan. This documentary will take you back to those desperate hours, step by step, with voices of history guiding you through the chaos, the bravery, and the unimaginable cost of seizing a speck of coral in the vast ocean. And as always, I want this to be more than just history. I want it to be a journey we share together. So let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and at what time of day. Are you listening late at night to fall asleep, in the quiet of the early morning, or somewhere in between? Your voice adds life to these stories, and together we keep their memory alive. So settle in, get comfortable, and join me now as we relive the entire Battle of Tarawa, the Pacific Atoll bloodbath that changed the course of the war. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific War had entered a new and unforgiving phase, reshaping the ambitions of both sides. The grueling campaign for Guadalcanal had ended in Allied victory, proving that the Japanese could be beaten on land, sea, and in the air. Yet that victory was not without cost, as disease, hunger, and exhaustion had ravaged both armies and left scars across the jungle battlefields. For the United States, Guadalcanal was more than a tactical success. It was the first step toward reclaiming the Pacific, one island at a time. The Japanese, once unstoppable in their early conquests, now found themselves on the defensive, forced to reinforce vast chains of islands with dwindling resources. American planners, buoyed by new ships sliding off the production lines, looked westward with growing confidence. The strategy of island hopping, bypassing strongholds to seize key positions, began to take shape in the minds of commanders. At its core was a brutal arithmetic: capture airfields, project power, and tighten the noose around Japan. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the debate centered on where to strike next, and the answer would place the Central Pacific at the very heart of the coming storm. The Central Pacific, stretching from the Gilberts to the Marshalls and beyond, was a maze of coral atolls and ocean expanses. To the untrained eye, these specks of land appeared insignificant, but to naval strategists they were stepping stones to Japan. Each atoll with an airfield represented a forward dagger, capable of hosting bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes. Possession of these islands meant not just control of territory, but the ability to dominate the sea lanes across thousands of miles. Japanese planners had recognized this early, fortifying outer islands with garrisons and bunkers to shield their empire. American strategists, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, understood that ignoring the Central Pacific would leave Japan's inner defenses unbroken. To advance through the South Pacific alone would take too long and stretch supply lines dangerously thin. Thus the decision was made to challenge Japan directly, head-on across the very ocean they once ruled uncontested. The stage was set for a series of amphibious invasions that would test doctrine, courage, and blood. Tarawa would be the crucible, but first came the larger vision, and that vision was nothing less than a march across the heart of the Pacific. At the strategic table, the Allies faced difficult choices in charting their path toward Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur championed a drive through New Guinea and the Philippines, honoring his famous vow to return. Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Nimitz, however, argued for a thrust across the Central Pacific, where the U.S. Navy could bring its growing strength to bear. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, balancing egos as much as strategy, endorsed a two-pronged advance, MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Nimitz through the Central Pacific. The division of effort ensured constant pressure on Japan, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts with resources they could ill afford to spare. For Nimitz and his commanders, the first test of this bold plan would be Operation Galvanic, the seizure of Tarawa and Macon in the Gilbert Islands. Tarawa was small, barely 2 miles long, but its airfield could dominate the approaches to the Marshalls. Success there would open the door to the next leap westward. Failure would stall the Allied advance, embolden the Japanese, and cost thousands of lives in vain. In late 1943, the Pacific War had reached a hinge moment, and the fate of nations would turn on it. The United States by then had transformed into a war machine, its industrial output unmatched anywhere in the world. Factories produced aircraft carriers, battleships, and landing craft at a pace the Japanese could not hope to rival. The U.S. Navy, bloodied but unbroken at Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal, now had the resources to strike in strength. Air groups trained relentlessly, Marines drilled for amphibious assaults, and new technologies were tested in the crucible of war. The Higgins boat, a simple wooden landing craft, became the spearhead of invasions, capable of disgorging men and machines onto hostile beaches. Yet doctrine lagged behind experience, and Guadalcanal had revealed gaps in coordination between sea, air, and land forces. Tarawa would demand precision at a scale never before attempted, an invasion launched directly against heavily fortified positions. The Marine Corps, steeped in tradition and sharpened by battle, prepared to prove that it could deliver. The U.S. Army and Navy stood ready to support them with unprecedented firepower. The resources were there, but the question was whether courage and doctrine could match the brutal demands ahead, and in that tension lay the drama of the coming battle. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to the shifting tides of war. Its early victories, spanning from Singapore to the Philippines, had stretched supply lines thin and left garrisons scattered across vast distances. By 1943, the Imperial Navy was no longer the master of the Pacific, its carriers crippled at Midway and its fleet weakened by attrition. The Japanese command understood the importance of the Central Pacific and fortified its atolls accordingly. On Tarawa, Rear Admiral K.G. Shibasaki proclaimed that 1,000,000 men could not take it in 100 years. His words reflected both defiance and the desperate gamble of a nation that could not match American industry. Japanese troops built bunkers of coconut logs and steel, prepared fields of fire, and emplaced artillery behind layers of coral. They knew reinforcements would not come if the island were attacked. Their orders were simple: resist to the death buy time and bleed the enemy. In that grim calculus, every hour of resistance was a victory, and Tarawa was chosen as the anvil upon which American resolve would be tested. The wider Pacific War in 1943 was a contest of momentum as much as territory. Every Allied victory tightened the ring around Japan. Every Japanese defense sought to delay the inevitable. Air superiority became increasingly decisive, with American carriers projecting power far beyond the horizon. Submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sinking Japanese merchant ships and starving the empire of fuel and supplies. The jungle battles of New Guinea contrasted with the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, showing the diverse and brutal geography of the theater. Soldiers and sailors alike had to adapt not just to the enemy, but to the unforgiving environment itself. Heat, humidity, disease, and endless distances were as much foes as bullets and shells. For the Marines preparing to storm Tarawa, the enemy would not only be Japanese firepower, but also the ocean and reef itself. The Pacific was a war of logistics, measured in miles of ocean crossed and gallons of fuel consumed. Victory demanded mastery of the seas, and the United States had begun to claim it. But claiming islands was another matter entirely, and Tarawa loomed as the ultimate test of amphibious war. The human dimension of this turning tide cannot be overlooked, for it was fought not just with ships and planes, but with hearts and minds. Young Marines, many barely out of high school, trained for months knowing their first battle might also be their last. Letters home spoke of duty, of fear cloaked in bravado, of faith that the war could be won. Japanese defenders, hardened by indoctrination, prepared to die rather than surrender, believing death in service to the emperor was the highest honor. Civilians, caught between empires, lived under occupation, their futures bound to the fortunes of war. Commanders on both sides carried burdens heavier than steel, knowing that thousands of lives depended on their judgment. The Pacific War was vast, but its battles were always intimate, fought in foxholes, on beaches, and in the hearts of men. Tarawa would compress this human drama onto a patch of coral barely visible on most maps, and in that compression lay the terrible intensity of what was to come. Thus, by the autumn of 1943, the Pacific stood at a crossroads of strategy, will, and destiny. The United States, rising in strength, sought to seize the initiative and press the advantage gained at Guadalcanal. Japan, weakened but defiant, dug in across its far-flung empire, determined to make every island a fortress. Between them lay the Central Pacific, a killing ground of atolls and lagoons that would test both doctrine and endurance. Tarawa, small though it was, became the symbol of this new phase, a battle that would decide more than the fate of a coral island. It would demonstrate whether the United States could break through Japan's outer defenses, or whether the Pacific War would drag on for years longer. The stakes, measured in blood and strategy alike, could not have been higher. Tarawa would become a proving ground for the future of amphibious warfare, and in its sands, the course of the Pacific War would be forever altered. At the far edge of the Gilbert Islands chain lay Betio, a tiny scrap of coral destined to be immortalized in blood. Barely 2 miles long and less than half a mile across at its widest point, it seemed an unlikely fortress. Its shape resembled a boomerang, with long sandy arms stretching into the turquoise lagoon. To the naked eye, it was a paradise: white beaches, coconut palms, and waters that shimmered under the tropical sun. But beneath that beauty lay deadly traps, for Betio was girded by coral reefs and shallow waters. These reefs would force landing craft to halt hundreds of yards from shore, leaving attackers to wade under fire. The island's flat terrain offered no cover, every movement exposed to machine guns and mortars. Betio's very geography conspired against invaders, turning its idyllic setting into a killing ground. The Marines who would land there would come to know its sands not as paradise, but as purgatory, and it was precisely this contrast that made Betio so lethal and unforgettable. The Japanese recognized Betio's deadly potential long before the Americans set their eyes upon it. In early 1943, they began fortifying the island with ruthless efficiency, transforming it into a bastion of defense. Coconut log bunkers were reinforced with steel and sand, some buried so deep they could withstand even battleship shells. A network of trenches, pillboxes, and gun pits interlocked across the island, ensuring no corner was left undefended. Heavy artillery pieces were emplaced to command both the lagoon and the seaward approaches. Along the beaches, barbed wire entanglements, mines, and wooden stakes were set to tear apart landing craft. Anti-boat obstacles bristled in the shallows, waiting for the tide to trap invaders upon them. By the time the defences were complete, Betio was described by one observer as the most heavily fortified island in the world for its size. Every square yard was a firing zone, every approach a death trap, and the men defending it believed they could hold against any assault. At the heart of these defences stood Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commander of the garrison, a veteran officer of the Imperial Navy. Shibasaki was a man of rigid discipline and unwavering belief in Japan's destiny. He commanded roughly 4,500 men, mostly elite special naval landing forces and labor troops turned fighters. His confidence bordered on arrogance, as reflected in his infamous boast that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. Shibasaki understood that reinforcements would never come, but his orders were absolute resist to the death. Under his command, the garrison drilled, fortified, and prepared themselves to meet the enemy on their own terms. Their morale was shaped by the samurai ethos of Bushido, where death was preferable to surrender. Every soldier was prepared to fight until annihilation, a mindset that would later shock American attackers. Shibasaki believed that by exacting a terrible price, his men could stall the American advance. On Betio, ideology fused with fortification to create a fortress of defiance. And in that mix, the stage was set for slaughter. The terrain itself favored defense, denying attackers even the smallest advantage. Betio's flatness meant that there were no hills to conceal advancing troops. The only vegetation consisted of scattered palm trees and undergrowth, quickly shredded under bombardment. The narrow beaches offered little space for maneuver, forcing waves of Marines to funnel into concentrated zones of fire. At low tide, the reefs jutted above the lagoon, trapping landing craft on the coral shelf. Marines would have to leap over the sides and wade through waist-deep water for hundreds of yards. Their weapons held above their heads, they would be silhouetted against the sea, easy targets for waiting gunners. Once ashore, the island gave no reprieve, every bunker connected to another, every trench line overlapping with fields of fire. Betio's smallness magnified its deadliness, compressing battle into the most intense of crucibles. And in that compression, every inch of ground would cost lives measured in blood. The Japanese defenses were not merely static, but designed with cunning interlocking fire. Machine guns were placed to rake the beaches with enfilade fire, cutting down men as they advanced. Mortars and light artillery were sighted to fall directly onto the lagoon approaches. Hidden sniper nests dotted the interiors of bunkers, waiting to pick off survivors who breached the first line. The defensive layout ensured that no single bunker could be neutralized without exposing attackers to another. Engineers built strongpoints capable of withstanding flamethrowers, requiring explosives and relentless close-quarters assaults to clear. Heavy 8-inch naval guns, salvaged from obsolete cruisers, were mounted in concrete to blast ships in the lagoon. Even the runways and open spaces were transformed into killing zones, ready to trap and annihilate attackers. Shibasaki's men were drilled to counterattack at night, slipping through trenches to strike where Marines least expected. It was not merely a defense, but a machine of destruction designed to devour an invasion, and the Americans would soon learn its efficiency at terrible cost. Yet for all its strength, Betio was not invulnerable, and American intelligence took careful note of its weaknesses. Reconnaissance flights mapped the bunkers and identified artillery positions, though many were missed or underestimated. Submarine patrols and coast watchers provided vital reports of troop strength and fortifications. Still, much of the island's true power remained hidden beneath camouflage and deception. American planners underestimated the effect of the reefs, believing tides would carry landing craft directly to the beaches. They also assumed naval bombardment would annihilate most defenses, a belief that proved tragically optimistic. In reality, many Japanese bunkers were so deeply buried that even heavy shells barely scratched them. These miscalculations would transform the landing into a nightmare. But in the fall of 1943, the US Navy and Marine Corps pressed forward with confidence. They believed their overwhelming firepower would shatter the island, and on that belief, the fate of thousands would soon hinge. For the Japanese soldiers on Betio, life before the invasion was harsh and unrelenting. Supplies were limited, and food was often rationed to bare survival levels. They toiled under the tropical sun to reinforce defenses, digging trenches through coral and laying mines in the sand. The garrison lived with the constant expectation of death, hardened by indoctrination and bound by loyalty to the emperor. Despite these hardships, morale remained high, as propaganda painted the coming battle as a chance for immortality. Many soldiers carved slogans into bunkers, pledging to fight until the last breath. Letters to families spoke of duty, of honor, and of the resolve to never surrender. They knew that when the Americans came, there would be no retreat and no rescue. Betio would be their grave, but also, in their eyes, their contribution to Japan's destiny. And in that mindset, they awaited the storm that would soon descend upon them. Thus Betio stood as a paradox of scale, a tiny island with the defenses of a fortress, an atoll turned battlefield, its geography, once a haven for fishermen and palm groves, had been reshaped into a labyrinth of fire and steel. The coral reef that had sustained life for centuries now became a trap for machines of war. Its defenders, outnumbered but unyielding, believed they could hold against the mightiest navy the world had ever assembled. To the Americans, it appeared a small obstacle on the road to Tokyo, yet it concealed horrors far greater than its size suggested. For in that small strip of sand and coral, modern warfare would reveal its most intimate brutality. The island called Betio was ready, its guns loaded, its trenches manned, its fate sealed. It waited for the roar of bombardment and the silhouettes of approaching landing craft. It waited to become the crucible of Tarawa, and it waited to etch its name forever into the history of the Pacific War. In the autumn of 1943, Allied strategists fixed their gaze upon a tiny dot in the Pacific Ocean, an island that seemed insignificant but held vast importance. Tarawa, a small atoll in the Gilbert Islands, was chosen as the next step in America's island-hopping campaign. Its value was not measured in palm trees or sandy beaches, but in its airfield, which could extend Allied air power deep into the Central Pacific. To the planners in Pearl Harbor and Washington, it was the first link in a chain that would stretch all the way to Japan itself. Without control of Tarawa, operations against the Marshalls would remain vulnerable to attack from Japanese aircraft. By seizing it, the Allies would secure a forward base from which to project both naval and air superiority. The logic was stark. Every mile gained brought American bombers closer to Tokyo. Every island captured narrowed Japan's shrinking defensive perimeter. Admiral Chester Nimitz recognized that hesitation would only allow the Japanese to fortify further. To advance, they needed a direct strike into the heart of the Central Pacific. And Tarawa, for all its smallness, was the key that unlocked that path. Operation Galvanic, the code name for the assault on Tarawa and nearby Macon, was designed to test America's new doctrine of large-scale amphibious warfare. The lessons of Guadalcanal were fresh, but they had been won in jungles, not on low coral atolls. Tarawa would demand something far more precise, a frontal assault on prepared defenses where every inch of ground was visible and every approach predictable. The island's Japanese garrison had transformed its beaches into interlocking fields of fire, daring any invader to try. Yet the planners believed their overwhelming fleet, their carriers, and their battleships could pulverize these defenses into submission. Securing the island would mean capturing an airstrip that could serve as a springboard into the Marshalls. It would also provide a logistics hub where fuel, ammunition, and supplies could be stockpiled within range of the next targets. Tarawa was, in essence, a gateway, a bloody test to determine whether American amphibious doctrine could succeed against Japan's outer defenses. The choice was not made lightly, for intelligence warned of heavy resistance. Still, the calculus of war demanded a demonstration of strength, and Tarawa was chosen as the proving ground. For the Japanese, the Gilbert Islands were part of their shield, a barrier meant to slow the advancing tide of American power. They knew they could not defend every island indefinitely, but each one bought time and inflicted losses. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commanding at Tarawa, was confident his garrison could hold long enough to make the enemy bleed. His famous boast that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years was more than arrogance. It was the foundation of Japan's defensive strategy. They believed that if enough Americans died on beaches like Betio, the will to continue would falter. Tokyo understood that Japan's industrial might could never match America's, but human sacrifice could still serve as a weapon. Each fortified atoll was meant to become a miniature fortress, its defenders fighting to the death with no hope of rescue. Tarawa, with its airfield and its strategic position, was among the most important of these bastions. The battle was inevitable, for both sides saw the island as essential to their vision of the Pacific War. And in that clash of visions, Tarawa was set to become a slaughterhouse. American planners studied the maps of Betio, the largest islet of Tarawa, with meticulous attention. Its airstrip stretched across the center, dominating the island and giving it immense operational value. To deny the Japanese use of this runway was as vital as capturing it for American fighters and bombers. Submarines and aerial reconnaissance brought back images of bunkers, gun emplacements, and anti-boat obstacles. Reports noted heavy artillery dug into the sand, covering both lagoon and ocean approaches. What was less certain was how effective the reefs would be in stopping landing craft, or how deeply the Japanese had buried their defenses. Still, the assumption was that naval bombardment would neutralize most of the garrison before the Marines stormed ashore. Confidence in American firepower shaped every aspect of the plan, even as some officers cautioned against over-reliance on artillery. Tarawa, they believed could be smashed open like an eggshell with enough shells and bombs. But as history would show, the Japanese had built a fortress that no bombardment alone could erase. The strategic importance of Tarawa lay not only in its own defences, but in what it guarded from its position in the Gilberts. Japanese planes could strike at Allied convoys moving westward. Without neutralizing it, any attempt to seize the Marshalls would leave American supply lines dangerously exposed. Conversely, in American hands, Tarawa would become a shield for advancing fleets, ensuring their safe passage deeper into enemy waters. It would also provide a launch point for bombers to harass Japanese strongholds across the region. Every mile of coral captured meant another mile of ocean secured, another step closer to the Japanese homeland. This was the logic of island hopping, seizing key positions, bypassing others, and moving relentlessly westward. Tarawa was small, but its capture would resonate far beyond its reefs. It was not simply a battle for an atoll, but a battle for momentum. And momentum was everything in a war of oceans, where distance itself was as deadly as any enemy. Political urgency added yet another layer to the decision. By 1943, the American public, weary from 2 years of war, demanded progress in the Pacific. Victory in the Central Pacific would not only cripple Japan, but also demonstrate that America's growing war machine could deliver results. Roosevelt's administration needed victories to sustain support at home, particularly with the war in Europe demanding simultaneous attention. For the Marines, Tarawa offered a chance to prove their worth in front of both allies and skeptics. For the Navy, it was an opportunity to showcase the might of its carriers and battleships. Success would silence critics, strengthen inter-service cooperation, and validate the doctrine of amphibious assault. Failure, however, would embolden Japan and shake public confidence in the war effort. Tarawa thus became more than a military target. It was a stage upon which national resolve would be tested. The stakes were not only strategic, but psychological, and those stakes would make the island sands run red. At sea, Admiral Nimitz entrusted Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner with the massive amphibious fleet that would carry the Marines to Tarawa. The 2nd Marine Division, under Major General Julian C. Smith, was assigned the task of storming the beaches and seizing Betio. They were hardened by training and lessons learned at Guadalcanal, but even so, none could fully grasp the nightmare that awaited. Engineers studied tidal charts and warned that the shallow lagoon might strand Higgins boats on the reefs. To counter this, a limited number of amphibious tractors, LVTs, were assigned to ferry troops directly over the coral. Still, there were not enough for all, and many Marines would have to wade ashore through chest-deep water. In planning rooms, maps and arrows made the assault appear orderly, almost clinical. But on Betio's beaches, every yard would be contested, every wave of men exposed to withering fire. The plan was daring, perhaps reckless, but it was the only way forward, and in the end, there was no turning back from the gamble. Thus, the decision to seize Tarawa was born of strategy, logistics, politics, and necessity. To the American command, it was a linchpin in the march across the Central Pacific, the first real test of their new amphibious doctrine. To the Japanese, it was a fortress designed to halt that march, or at least make it so costly that the enemy might reconsider. Both sides saw the island not as a mere speck of coral, but as a symbol of control over the Pacific's future. Every trench dug, every gun emplaced, every plan written in ink and sand carried the weight of this larger vision. The island would become the proving ground for technology, doctrine, and human courage under fire. It was where theories would meet reality and where maps would be redrawn in blood. The Marines prepared to land, the Navy prepared to shell, and the Japanese prepared to die. Tarawa was not chosen for its beauty or its bounty, but for its position on the road to Tokyo, and soon it would become a name synonymous with sacrifice. On the tiny islet of Betio, the Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, prepared his men for what he believed would be a battle of annihilation. Shibasaki was no ordinary officer. He was a seasoned veteran of the Imperial Navy and a man of fierce conviction. He believed deeply in the Bushido spirit, the warrior ethos that demanded death before surrender. Under his command were nearly 5,000 men, including elite special naval landing forces, Japan's equivalent of Marines. They were bolstered by Korean laborers and civilian conscripts who were pressed into constructing defenses and even expected to fight if necessary. Shibasaki knew that American power dwarfed his own, but he sought to compensate with discipline, preparation, and fanatic resistance. His orders were absolute: hold Tarawa at all costs, fight to the last man, and ensure the enemy paid in blood for every inch of coral. In his mind, the fate of the Pacific War was not decided in grand strategies, but in the will of soldiers to endure. This conviction would shape the nightmare awaiting the U.S. Marines, and it would make Tarawa one of the fiercest battles of the Pacific. The Japanese garrison transformed Betio into a fortress that defied its natural smallness. The island measured less than 3 miles in length and barely 800 yards across at its widest point, yet every grain of sand was prepared for battle. Shibasaki's engineers constructed bunkers of steel-reinforced concrete, some with walls 5 feet thick, capable of withstanding naval bombardment. Along the beaches, pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire created kill zones designed to sweep the lagoon approaches clean. Heavy machine guns were mounted to cover every possible landing point, while 13 coastal defense guns ranged from 75 pieces to 8-inch naval artillery. Even more deadly were the mortars and howitzers positioned inland, ready to strike at Marines once they crossed the beaches. Trenches zigzagged across the island, linking strong points into a web of resistance that allowed units to support one another under fire. Obstacles of barbed wire, mines, and wooden stakes were laid across the lagoon floor, designed to cripple landing craft before they reached the shore. The result was a miniature fortress, layered in depth and bristling with lethal intent. Betio was small, but it was prepared to devour invaders. Among Shibasaki's defenders, the Special Naval Landing Forces held pride of place. These were not ordinary garrison troops, but highly trained assault infantry, drilled for amphibious and defensive combat. Their black uniforms and high morale marked them as an elite within the Imperial Navy, and they brought with them a fierce determination to hold ground, no matter the cost. Their training emphasized fanatical endurance, close quarters fighting, and the belief that death in battle was the ultimate honor. Unlike some Japanese garrisons on remote islands, these men were seasoned, disciplined, and confident in their commander's plan. They were supported by hundreds of naval artillery specialists, engineers, and anti-aircraft crews who ensured the island's guns were always ready. Each man knew his position, his weapon, and his role in the defensive scheme. They were indoctrinated with the conviction that surrender was impossible and survival unlikely. To them, Tarawa was not a place to live, but a place to die for the emperor, and with that grim resolve, they braced themselves for the storm they knew was coming. Shibasaki himself projected an aura of defiant confidence, one that inspired his men even as it underestimated his enemy. His declaration that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years became a rallying cry across the island. To his soldiers, it was both boast and promise that their sacrifice would halt the American advance, or at least shatter its momentum. He walked among his troops, assuring them that the coral reefs, the mines, and the bunkers would turn back any invader. He reminded them that the Imperial Navy had humiliated the Americans at Pearl Harbor, that their enemies were soft and unwilling to accept heavy losses. His words carried weight because they reflected the Japanese worldview. Victory was not always measured by survival, but by inflicting maximum casualties. Even if Tarawa fell, it would be remembered as a place where Americans paid dearly. This belief strengthened the garrison's morale, giving them purpose in what was essentially a death sentence. Shibasaki's bravado was reckless, but it bound his soldiers together in a shared destiny, and destiny was all they had left. The physical conditions on Betio only added to the defenders' grim determination. The island's coral soil made it possible to dig deep bunkers, while the limited vegetation provided clear fields of fire. Japanese engineers turned every coconut log and scrap of steel into fortifications, crafting ingenious structures that could withstand direct hits. Some bunkers were interconnected by underground passages, allowing defenders to retreat unseen and reappear behind American assault teams. Ammunition dumps were hidden in thick-walled shelters, and artillery pieces were cleverly camouflaged. The defenders even positioned anti-boat guns to fire into the lagoon, where they expected most of the American landings. Mines were laid not just on the beaches but also in the shallow waters, where Marines would have to wade in full view of the garrison. From observation towers, spotters could direct fire with chilling precision, ensuring that no area was left unprotected. Every detail of the terrain was studied and prepared for maximum lethality. Tarawa was not just defended, it was engineered into a machine of destruction. Life for the garrison before the invasion was one of tense anticipation, but morale remained high. The soldiers drilled constantly, rehearsing responses to amphibious assaults, manning their guns and fortifying their trenches. Supplies had been stockpiled for months, ensuring that food, ammunition, and medical supplies would last even under siege. Shibasaki instilled in his men the idea that they were the last barrier standing between Japan and defeat. Though cut off from reinforcements, they took pride in their isolation, seeing it as proof of their unique mission. In quiet moments, some soldiers wrote letters they knew might never be sent, while others prepared themselves through ritual and prayer. The Korean laborers, many working under coercion, had no such luxury, often forced into the most dangerous tasks of construction. Yet even they were swept into the garrison's fate, trapped in the same small island that would soon become a battlefield. For the Japanese soldiers, death was expected. For the laborers, it was simply unavoidable. Together they shared the cramped, tense confines of Betio, waiting for the sky to darken with American planes. The Japanese defense plan depended on one fundamental principle: inflict maximum losses before yielding a single yard of ground. Shibasaki ordered that no counterattacks be wasted offshore, no banzai charges launched prematurely. Instead, his strategy was to make the beaches kill zones, destroying the enemy at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. The Marines would be trapped between the sea and the bunkers, exposed and unable to maneuver. Artillery and machine guns would rain fire upon them, while mortars bracketed every likely landing zone. If by chance the Americans gained a foothold, secondary bunkers and reserve squads would unleash close-quarters combat. Every inch of sand was mapped for defense, every trench measured for firepower overlap. Unlike battles in the jungles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa would offer no cover, no respite from the iron rain. The Japanese expected annihilation, but they demanded it come at the highest possible price. In this, Shibasaki and his men were prepared to succeed. For them, the measure of victory was the enemy's blood, not their own survival. Thus, by November 1943, Tarawa stood as one of the most formidable strongholds in the Pacific. Small in size but immense in preparation, the island embodied Japan's strategy of turning every atoll into a fortress. Shibasaki commanded not just soldiers, but believers, men who accepted death as inevitable and embraced it as their duty. The fortifications they built were not meant to preserve life, but to guarantee destruction, both theirs and their enemies. The Special Naval Landing Forces were the spear point of this grim design, disciplined and fanatical in their resolve. The coral beaches were mined, the waters trapped, the skies watched, and every gun calibrated. Betio was ready to meet the full fury of America's modern war machine with raw defiance. To the outside world, it was a tiny speck of land, but to those who would fight there, it was the center of destiny. Soon the lagoon would be filled with ships, the sky with aircraft, and the sand with blood, and the Japanese defenders of Tarawa would be waiting, prepared to die to the last man. By the autumn of 1943, the United States Marine Corps had become more than a fighting force. It had become a symbol of America's determination in the Pacific. Hardened by the brutal campaigns on Guadalcanal, Marines carried with them scars of jungle fighting, hunger, disease, and relentless Japanese counterattacks. Now, under Major General Julian C. Smith, the 2nd Marine Division stood at the forefront of a new kind of war. Their mission was not simply to fight, but to prove that amphibious assaults could crack fortified islands defended to the last man. The stakes could not have been higher, for the world watched to see if the Marines could take Tarawa. Failure would cast doubt on America's entire island-hopping strategy, while success would light the path across the Pacific. Each Marine knew that they were being asked to do something no army in history had attempted on such a scale. They would face not jungles or open battlefields, but beaches saturated with firepower, reefs bristling with mines, and defenders who had sworn never to surrender. The challenge was immense, but the Marines carried with them the confidence of hard-earned experience. And with that confidence, they prepared to make history. The 2nd Marine Division was a seasoned unit, numbering roughly 18,000 men organized into 3 infantry regiments, supported by artillery, engineers, and armored units. Many of its officers and NCOs had fought at Guadalcanal, bringing with them invaluable knowledge of Japanese tactics. Yet the battlefield ahead was unlike anything they had known before, a place where concealment was nearly impossible, and survival meant advancing across open ground. Training for Tarawa had been relentless, with rehearsals of amphibious landings staged across Pacific beaches. Marines practiced storming ashore from Higgins boats and amphibious tractors, timing every movement with precision. Engineers drilled on clearing obstacles, while riflemen rehearsed advancing under the cover of naval bombardment. Tanks were tested on sand, flamethrowers issued, and demolition charges prepared for bunkers. Each man carried the knowledge that in the first wave, survival was far from certain. But together the division believed that discipline, training, and sheer determination could overcome the island's defenses, and it was that belief that bound them together on the eve of battle. Major General Julian C. Smith, their commander, embodied calm resolve in the face of daunting odds. Known for his discipline and professionalism, Smith was not a man of flamboyant words, but of quiet authority. He studied every detail of the invasion plan, balancing optimism with caution, aware that success depended on both precision and courage. Smith understood that Tarawa would test not only tactics, but also the spirit of his men, and he worked tirelessly to prepare them for the ordeal. His leadership was steady, never overstated, but it inspired confidence at every level of the division. He was supported by a staff of experienced officers, many of whom had learned their trade in the crucible of Guadalcanal. Together, they forged a division that was not only trained for war, but mentally conditioned for sacrifice. Smith knew that his Marines would face terrible casualties, but he believed in their ability to carry the island. He placed faith in their courage, their discipline, and their will to finish what others could not. Under his command, the 2nd Marine Division braced itself for the hardest fight of its life. The Marines carried with them the tools of modern amphibious assault, weapons tailored for close-range destruction. They would go ashore armed with M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and light machine guns, weapons designed for ferocious short-distance combat. Engineers were equipped with satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes, and flamethrowers, all critical for clearing bunkers and trenches. Sherman tanks fitted with 75 mm guns provided mobile firepower, though questions remained about how well they would maneuver on the soft coral sand. Mortar and artillery support would follow them ashore, though much depended on the success of naval bombardment. The Marines trained to fight as squads, each unit flexible, aggressive, and capable of acting independently under fire. They knew the Japanese would be entrenched, invisible until they unleashed their weapons. The Marines prepared to counter with speed, violence, and relentless pressure, never allowing the enemy a moment to regroup. Every man's pack carried not just ammunition, but the heavy weight of expectation. And in the weapons they carried, America placed its trust that Tarawa could be taken. Among the innovations the Marines brought to Tarawa were the amphibious tractors, or LVTs, machines that would change the very nature of the assault. Unlike the Higgins boats which risked grounding on the reef, the LVTs could crawl over coral and deliver troops directly onto the beach. Each was armed with machine guns and capable of carrying 20 men, offering both transport and firepower. For many Marines, the LVTs represented their best chance of survival in the first minutes of the invasion, yet there were far too few of them, barely enough for a fraction of the assault waves. Most Marines would still be forced to disembark from Higgins boats and wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water. This meant advancing under fire without cover, exposed to machine guns and artillery in broad daylight. The tractors symbolized both progress and limitation, a glimpse of the future but not yet available in sufficient numbers. To the Marines they were a lifeline, even as they knew many would never reach the shore. And in those machines hope and fear mingled as they rehearsed their final approach. Morale in the division was complex, a mixture of pride, anxiety, and grim acceptance. The Marines had proven themselves at Guadalcanal, and they carried with them the reputation of America's shock troops. They knew the nation expected them to succeed, no matter the cost. Letters home carried confidence, but also hints of foreboding, as men sensed the scale of the coming battle. They joked in their foxholes, sang songs aboard their transports, and argued over baseball scores, but beneath it all was the knowledge of what awaited. Chaplains held services, offering comfort in words that could not erase the looming fear. Veterans reassured younger Marines, reminding them that survival depended on keeping moving, never hesitating under fire. Some men carved names into their rifles or painted slogans on their helmets, small gestures of identity in a sea of anonymity. In every platoon, friendships ran deep, forged by training and the certainty of shared fate, and it was those bonds as much as weapons or plans that gave them strength to face Tarawa. The Marines of the 2nd Division represented a cross-section of America, drawn from cities, farms, and factories across the nation. Many were barely out of high school, their youth colliding with the harsh realities of war. Others were seasoned veterans, carrying the experience of previous battles and guiding their comrades with steady hands. Each brought with him a story, a family, and dreams that might never be realized. Together they formed a fighting force bound by discipline, loyalty, and an unspoken promise to one another. For them, Tarawa was not an abstract strategy or a line on a map. It was the place where survival and duty would meet. They were taught to think of the mission, the division, and the corps above themselves. Yet in quiet moments, each Marine wrestled with private fears, the knowledge that the odds were stacked against them. The strength of the division lay not only in its weapons, but in the humanity of the men who carried them. And it was this humanity that would be tested to the breaking point on Betio's sands. Thus, as the fleet assembled, and the Marines prepared to embark, America's new weapon stood ready. The 2nd Marine Division was more than an infantry force. It was the embodiment of a doctrine that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. They carried not only rifles and flamethrowers, but the burden of proving that island fortresses could be stormed and taken. Their commander believed in them, their training prepared them, and their nation depended on them. They were about to face an enemy entrenched, fanatical, and determined to die rather than surrender. They would land on beaches designed to kill, across reefs that could drown them, against bunkers that could swallow whole squads. Yet in their hearts burned the certainty that no matter the cost, the mission had to succeed. They were Marines, and this was their proving ground. Tarawa would test their courage, their training, and their very identity as warriors. And soon, the world would learn what America's new weapon could endure. In the summer of 1943, the United States Navy and Marine Corps undertook one of the most ambitious operations yet conceived in the Pacific, the seizure of Tarawa under the codename Operation Galvanic. The plan represented the first true test of America's developing amphibious doctrine, forged in theory before the war and bloodily tested at Guadalcanal. Unlike the Solomon Islands campaign, however, Tarawa offered no jungle depths, no vast hinterland into which defenders might retreat. It was a speck of coral less than 3 miles long, where every mistake would be visible, immediate, and costly. The planners knew they were facing a fortress, constructed with precision and manned by defenders determined to die. Naval intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and submarine patrols brought back photographs and charts that mapped every possible landing point. These were pinned on walls in war rooms, where officers debated every detail of tides, reefs, and firepower. The Marines demanded precision, and the Navy demanded coordination on a scale never before attempted. For Operation Galvanic was not only a battle for an island, it was a test of America's ability to project power across an ocean, and if it failed, the path to Japan would be thrown into doubt. At the heart of the planning lay the hard lessons of Guadalcanal, where improvisation and chaos had nearly undone the American effort. The Navy and Marines had clashed bitterly over coordination, with naval commanders withdrawing under threat, and Marines left stranded ashore. Operation Galvanic was intended to correct those failures, forging a tighter bond between sea and land. Vice Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, fresh from victory in the Central Pacific, assumed overall command of the operation. His calm intellect and meticulous style reassured many, though he knew the challenges ahead could not be underestimated. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces, carried responsibility for delivering the Marines to Betio's beaches. He demanded precision in logistics, the careful synchronization of bombardment, landing craft, and close air support. General Julian C. Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, insisted on clarity in communication and decisive naval firepower. Together, they built a plan where every movement, from battleship shell to rifle squad, was synchronized in one relentless assault. But even the most perfect plan could not erase the uncertainty of battle, and in those uncertainties, Tarawa's fate would be decided. Central to the doctrine was the concept of overwhelming firepower, delivered in layers from battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. The planners envisioned a storm of steel that would crush bunkers, flatten trenches, and obliterate defenders before the Marines set foot on the beaches. The bombardment would be followed by relentless waves of amphibious assault craft, ferrying Marines in carefully timed intervals. Naval aviators flying from carriers offshore would strafe and bomb defensive positions in support of advancing troops. Every element of the plan relied on coordination, the Navy suppressing defenses at the exact moment Marines crossed reefs, artillery covering advances when infantry stalled, aircraft striking targets designated by observers on the beach. This was modern war in its most intricate form, demanding trust between services that had not always seen eye to eye. Guadalcanal had shown what happened when that trust broke down. Tarrier would demand that it hold. The stakes were more than tactical. They were doctrinal, proving whether amphibious warfare could succeed against a fortified island. If it failed, the entire Central Pacific campaign would collapse into doubt, and failure was a price no one was willing to pay. The planning also revealed the difficulties of amphibious warfare at a level of detail no previous battle had required. Tidal charts were studied obsessively, for the lagoon's shallow waters threatened to strand landing craft on reefs far from shore. Engineers worried that Higgins boats could not clear the coral, leaving Marines exposed to machine guns as they waded through chest-deep water. Amphibious tractors, the LVTs, offered a solution, but their limited numbers meant only a fraction of the assault waves could use them. Naval officers debated the length and intensity of the bombardment, some demanding prolonged shelling, while others feared exhausting ammunition. The Marines argued for closer fire support and more precise coordination between ships and assault waves. Behind every decision lay the memory of Guadalcanal's chaos, a warning against complacency. Even so, there was tension between optimism and caution, between the belief in overwhelming power and the fear of unexpected disaster. Operation Galvanic demanded a balance between calculated risk and decisive aggression, and on the coral reefs of Tarawa, that balance would be tested like never before. Logistics formed another pillar of the operation, for the assault would require a vast armada to sustain thousands of tons of supplies, had to be loaded onto transports with meticulous care, each item positioned for rapid unloading under fire. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and engineering equipment were distributed in calculated proportions, for shortages could doom the operation. Troop transports carried Marines who rehearsed landings repeatedly, practicing every motion from descending cargo nets to sprinting off landing ramps. Tanks and artillery pieces were lashed to decks, waiting to be lowered by cranes into the surf. Communication equipment was checked and rechecked, for coordination between ship and shore would depend on fragile radios. Medical teams prepared for mass casualties, setting up makeshift hospitals on ships to handle the wounded. Chaplains offered blessings, knowing many Marines would not return alive from the beaches. Every detail was measured against the reality that the enemy was watching, preparing, and waiting. Operation Galvanic was as much a logistical feat as a military one, and it was this web of preparation, that would carry the Marines into the crucible. At its core, Operation Galvanic was not just a battle plan, but a statement of America's strategic intent. It represented a shift from the cautious advance through the Solomons to a direct thrust into the Central Pacific. By striking Tarawa, the Allies announced their determination to carve a path across the ocean, regardless of the cost. It was also a signal to Japan that no fortress, however small or fortified, would be beyond reach. The plan reflected confidence in America's growing naval power, a fleet of carriers, battleships, and transports unmatched by any in history. It also reflected faith in the Marines as the cutting edge of amphibious warfare, the men who would translate strategy into blood-soaked reality. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward was greater still, an airfield that would open the Marshalls and close the gap to Japan. Operation Galvanic was thus both practical and symbolic, a marriage of necessity and demonstration. The world would see whether America's doctrine could succeed against a determined enemy, and the men of the fleet and division knew that their performance would echo far beyond Tarawa's reefs. Yet for all the planning, doubts remained in the minds of many commanders. Would the bombardment be long enough to destroy defenses hardened against artillery? Would the tides favor the Marines, or would they leave them stranded in the lagoon under enemy fire? Would coordination between Navy and Marines hold under the chaos of battle, or collapse as it had before? Questions haunted the war rooms, even as plans were finalized, for no doctrine could account for every variable. Shibasaki's defenders had fortified Betio with ingenuity and determination, and no one knew exactly how they would respond. Some officers predicted quick victory, others warned of heavy losses, but all agreed that the battle would be decisive. It was more than an invasion, it was an experiment with blood as the measure of success. For the Marines, it would be their chance to prove their worth as America's shock troops. For the Navy, it would demonstrate that the fleet could carry the war across the Pacific. And for both, Tarawa would be a crucible from which new doctrine would either rise or collapse. Thus, Operation Galvanic stood ready, a convergence of strategy, doctrine, and determination. It was the culmination of months of planning, rehearsals, and debates, woven into a single plan of assault. Every commander knew that the cost would be high, but none could predict just how high. The Marines sharpened their bayonets, the Navy loaded its shells, and the carriers fueled their aircraft. Across the Pacific, a vast armada assembled, carrying with it the weight of national expectation. For the men who would land on Betio, the plan was both a shield and a burden, offering hope even as it forecast horror. For the commanders, it was a gamble, one that would test their doctrine against an enemy that had sworn never to yield. And for history, it was the moment when amphibious warfare would either prove itself or collapse in failure. The Pacific awaited the storm, and Tarawa was the target. Soon Operation Galvanic would move from paper and rehearsal to fire and blood, and the world would never forget the price of that experiment. By November 1943, the waters of the Central Pacific churned with steel and wake, as the United States gathered the mightiest fleet yet seen in the Pacific War. Carriers stretched across the horizon, their decks stacked with fighters and dive bombers that would dominate the skies over Tarawa. Battleships, survivors of Pearl Harbor now rebuilt and thirsting for revenge, steamed alongside newer Leviathans, built for this very moment. Cruisers and destroyers fanned out in protective screens, their guns ready to pound the coral island into rubble. Behind them trailed lines of transports carrying thousands of Marines, crammed together with rifles, tanks, and supplies. Tankers and supply ships completed the armada, ensuring that the fleet could fight for weeks without pause. This was no hastily assembled task force, but a deliberate projection of overwhelming power, orchestrated by Admiral Raymond Spruance. Every ship had its role, every vessel a place in the choreography of invasion. The sea itself seemed to groan under the weight of America's war machine, and at its heart the fate of Tarawa would be decided. The carriers were the crown jewels of this armada, floating airfields that extended American power far beyond the reach of land bases. Task Force 50, under Vice Admiral Charles Pownall, included carriers such as USS X, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Yorktown. Each carried air groups of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes capable of delivering devastation in waves. Pilots had trained relentlessly for precision strikes, knowing that every bunker on Betio might require direct hits to silence. Their missions would include bombing runs, strafing attacks, and relentless air cover for Marines once ashore. To the men on deck, the mission was both terrifying and exhilarating, for they knew they carried the burden of softening a fortress. Mechanics worked day and night, tuning engines and checking bomb racks, while ordnance crews loaded munitions into endless stacks. The flight decks buzzed with activity, a choreography of steel, fuel, and fire. These carriers were the cutting edge of American naval power, their wings reaching where battleships could not, and soon their engines would roar over Tarawa's skies. The battleships brought with them the thunder of naval artillery, weapons whose destructive power dwarfed anything on land. USS Maryland, USS Colorado, USS Tennessee, and others carried 14-inch and 16-inch guns, capable of hurling shells the size of cars. Their task was to hammer Japanese defenses into dust, cratering bunkers and silencing coastal artillery. Crews drilled constantly, calibrating their fire with spotters and preparing for hours of sustained bombardment. Many of these ships had once been scarred by Japanese bombs at Pearl Harbor, now reborn to deliver vengeance. Their steel hulls bristled with new anti-aircraft batteries, ensuring that enemy planes would find no easy targets. Sailors polished brass, loaded shells, and whispered prayers that their fire would protect the Marines about to storm the beaches. To them, the bombardment was not just duty, but retribution, a chance to repay debts written in the smoke of December 1941. On the eve of battle, the battleships loomed like ancient gods of war, their guns trained on Betio, and with their roar, the invasion would begin. Cruisers formed the swift backbone of the fleet, versatile warships that combined heavy guns with speed and maneuverability. Ships like USS Minneapolis and USS San Francisco brought 8-inch guns capable of rapid, sustained fire against shore targets. Their role was to sweep away Japanese artillery that threatened landing craft, and to provide constant support once the Marines were ashore. Destroyers darted among them, smaller but deadly, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes. These greyhounds of the sea would move dangerously close to Betio, their gunners prepared to duel with Japanese coastal defenses at point-blank range. Their crews were young, many barely out of high school, yet they carried themselves with the confidence of veterans. On their decks, sailors smoked nervously and tightened the straps of helmets, waiting for the command to fire. Together, cruisers and destroyers were the flexible fists of the fleet, able to respond instantly to changing needs. They were the unseen guardians of the Marines, delivering steel whenever called upon, and in the crucible of Tarawa, their accuracy would mean survival or death. Behind the warships stretched the vital but often overlooked backbone of the invasion, the transports and support ships. Hundreds of vessels carried Marines, tanks, trucks, food, water, and ammunition, the lifeblood of the operation. Each transport was crammed with men sleeping shoulder to shoulder, eating from tin mess kits, and rehearsing the landings again and again. Below decks, tanks and artillery pieces were chained to floors, ready to be hoisted into the surf by cranes. Cargo ships held mountains of supplies, from rifle cartridges to medical bandages, every item meticulously labeled. Oilers and supply ships ensured that the fleet could remain at sea for weeks, fueling the carriers and battleships that would pound Tarawa day after day. For the sailors on these ships, their role was less glamorous but no less essential, for without them the invasion would collapse in days. Many watched nervously as they neared the island, aware that they would be within range of Japanese guns. These ships carried no heavy armor, only hope and necessity, and within their holds, the future of the campaign waited to be unleashed. The scale of the armada astonished even veterans of earlier campaigns. Over 200 ships stretched across the Pacific horizon, a seaborne city of steel, smoke, and humanity. At its core were more than 35,000 sailors and 18,000 marines, a force greater than any yet assembled in the Central Pacific. Each vessel flew the stars and stripes, a reminder of the industrial power that now surged westward across the ocean. The fleet embodied the transformation of the United States into a global military giant, capable of projecting power across thousands of miles. For many sailors and marines, the sight of so many ships together was both inspiring and sobering. It was proof of their nation's might, but also a stark reminder that so much power was being brought to bear on a tiny island. As the armada closed in, conversations hushed and eyes turned toward the horizon. Soon the great machine would move from preparation to action, and from action to sacrifice. And within that fleet, every man knew his part in the unfolding drama. The journey to Tarawa was not without tension, for Japanese submarines prowled the Pacific, hunting for targets among the great fleet. Destroyers swept the seas with sonar, dropping depth charges at every suspicious contact. Sailors scanned the skies for enemy aircraft, though the Japanese had little left to challenge such a force. At night, blackout rules cloaked the fleet in darkness, leaving only the glow of stars above the rolling ocean. The Marines slept fitfully in their bunks, haunted by thoughts of the coming battle. On deck, officers studied maps under red lights, rehearsing the sequence of bombardments and landings. Chaplains walked among the men, offering prayers and quiet comfort before the storm broke. The armada moved like a single organism, every ship following its orders with precision. The sea around them was alive with motion, the sound of engines and the slap of waves against steel, and with every mile they drew closer to the coral fortress of Betio. Thus the stage was set, with the largest Pacific fleet yet assembled, bearing down on the tiny atoll of Tarawa. It was a collision of extremes, the vast power of industrial America against the small entrenched garrison of Japan. The carriers carried death in the form of bombers, the battleships thundered with shells, and the marines prepared to storm ashore. Every man aboard the armada knew that history was about to be written in fire and blood. The fleet was not merely an assembly of ships, but the embodiment of doctrine, strategy, and determination. It represented the future of warfare, a demonstration that oceans could no longer shield fortresses from the reach of modern navies. Tarawa was chosen as the proving ground, and the fleet carried the promise of victory and the certainty of sacrifice. Soon the guns would thunder, the aircraft would rise, and the marines would descend into hell. The Pacific lay silent before the storm, holding its breath for the clash to come. And when the fleet opened fire, the world would feel its tremor. On the morning of November 20th, 1943, The calm waters around Betio erupted with a fury never before witnessed in the Central Pacific. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire in a coordinated barrage designed to shatter the island into submission. Their 14-inch and 16-inch guns hurled massive shells that screamed through the air before slamming into the coral with thunderous detonations. Columns of smoke and dust rose above the palm trees, blotting out the horizon and leaving the island cloaked in fire. From the decks of transports offshore, Marines cheered as they watched the explosions roll across their target. Carrier aircraft swooped in low, dropping bombs and strafing defensive positions with streams of tracer fire. To the men watching, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such a storm of steel and flame. Every shell, every bomb was meant to silence a bunker, kill a gun crew, or collapse a trench. The fury of American naval might was on full display, a promise that nothing could withstand its weight. And yet beneath the smoke, the Japanese defenders endured. The bombardment was the centerpiece of Operation Galvanic, a calculated attempt to crush the enemy before the Marines hit the beaches. American planners believed that prolonged shelling would level bunkers, detonate ammunition stores, and annihilate defenders in their positions. Battleships like USS Maryland and USS Colorado poured round after round into the island, while cruisers and destroyers raked it with rapid-fire guns. Carrier planes dropped 500-pound bombs, blasting craters into the airfield and setting buildings aflame. The island shook under the impact, its coral surface torn and scarred as if by some apocalyptic force. Observers offshore marveled at the spectacle, convinced that the defenders could not possibly withstand such punishment. Yet inside their bunkers, Japanese troops crouched behind steel-reinforced walls, waiting for the storm to pass. They had been trained to expect bombardment, and had prepared their defenses with painstaking care. Concrete, coconut logs, and buried gun positions absorbed the shock of explosions, and while some positions were indeed destroyed, the majority remained intact. The failure lay not in the firepower itself, but in the nature of the target and the limitations of naval gunnery. Betio was small, flat, and bristling with fortifications buried deep into the coral. Many of the Japanese bunkers were hidden from direct fire, shielded by clever construction and camouflage. Naval gunners firing from miles offshore could not see individual pillboxes or gun pits beneath the smoke. Shells cratered the surface but often missed the concealed strongpoints that mattered most. Bombs from carrier aircraft had devastating effect when they struck directly, but many fell wide or exploded harmlessly on the sand. Worse still, the bombardment was cut short, lasting barely 3 hours due to concerns over ammunition and tidal timing. The Navy feared that prolonged shelling would delay the landings and leave Marines stranded on reefs when the tide shifted. Thus the assault began with Japanese defenses far less damaged than expected, and in that miscalculation lay the seeds of disaster. Inside the bunkers, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki's men endured the inferno with grim determination. Special Naval Landing Force troops crouched in dim chambers, lit by lanterns, listening to the earthquake around them. Concrete walls trembled, coconut logs splintered, and dust filled their lungs, but most bunkers held firm. Officers barked orders to remain silent, conserving ammunition and waiting for the moment of attack. Mortar crews clutched their weapons, their pits reinforced with layers of coral and timber. Artillerymen checked the breeches of their coastal guns, ready to re-emerge once the shelling ceased. Some men prayed, others clenched their teeth, all of them bound by the oath to die where they stood. When bombs struck directly, entire squads vanished in flashes of heat and shrapnel, their screams muffled by the roar of explosions. Yet the survivors emerged from the smoke with weapons intact, ready to fire. For them, the bombardment was not destruction but prelude. From the perspective of the Marines watching offshore, the bombardment created a dangerous illusion. Clouds of dust and fire gave the impression of total devastation, as if Betio itself had ceased to exist. Many believed that resistance would be minimal, that the Japanese had been obliterated beneath the barrage. Confidence surged among the assault troops, who joked that their only challenge would be reaching the beach before the island disappeared. Officers reassured their men that naval guns had done their work, that casualties would be light. Few realized how little effect the bombardment had truly achieved beneath the surface. In truth, the Japanese had designed their defenses to survive just such a storm, and their guns would soon emerge unscathed. The Marines, unaware of what awaited, prepared to storm beaches that bristled with hidden firepower. They sharpened their bayonets, checked their gear, and prepared for the signal to land. And as they watched the bombardment fade, they believed victory was already in hand. The decision to shorten the bombardment remains one of the most controversial choices of the battle. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious task force, feared that the tide would fall too low for landing craft to clear the reef. He ordered the assault to proceed earlier than some commanders preferred, curtailing the shelling in favor of timing. Marines argued that an extra day of bombardment could have pulverized more defenses, but Turner prioritized momentum over thoroughness. It was a gamble rooted in the unforgiving realities of amphibious warfare, where tides and schedules dictated survival. Critics later charged that the decision cost thousands of Marines their lives, condemning them to land against defenses still largely intact. Supporters argued that hesitation could have been worse, allowing Japanese reinforcements or counterattacks to complicate the operation. Regardless of intent, the outcome was clear. When the Marines went ashore, they faced defenses that had survived the storm. Tarawa was not a ruined husk, but a fortress waiting to erupt, and the price of that miscalculation would be written in blood. The Japanese defenders emerged from their shelters as the bombardment lifted, their positions battered but far from destroyed. Machine gunners slid open firing slits, peering out at the lagoon now churned with smoke and foam. Artillery crews remanned their guns, aiming at the empty sea where landing craft would soon appear. Snipers climbed into concealed positions, their rifles ready to pick off exposed Marines. Mortar tubes were uncovered, crews ready to rain shells into the shallow waters of the lagoon. Shibasaki's men knew the battle was about to begin in earnest, their long wait inside bunkers finally ending. For them, survival was irrelevant. Their mission was to kill as many Americans as possible. Their weapons had survived, their spirits were unbroken, and their commander's promise still held firm. The bombardment had shaken them, but it had not broken them. And as silence fell, the defenders prepared for the slaughter to come. Thus, the great naval and aerial bombardment of Betio, though impressive in scale, failed in its ultimate purpose. It scarred the island, filled the air with smoke, and convinced Marines that victory was assured. Yet beneath the rubble, the fortress remained, its bunkers alive with defenders who had endured the storm. The miscalculation would transform the coming landing into one of the bloodiest struggles in Marine Corps history. The belief in overwhelming firepower had clashed with the reality of determined defenders and ingenious fortifications. The lessons of Guadalcanal had been studied but not fully absorbed, and the cost of that oversight was about to be paid. When the first wave of Marines left their transports, they would discover the truth in fire and death. The island was not broken, it was waiting. The bombardment had been the prelude, not the conclusion, and the true battle for Tarawa was only about to begin. At dawn on November 20th, 1943, The calm lagoon at Betio erupted into chaos as the first wave of Marines prepared to land. Amphibious tractors, known as LVTs, churned through the shallow waters, carrying men toward the island under a grey, smoky sky. Behind them, Higgins boats formed lines, their ramps ready to disgorge Marines directly onto the beaches. Yet almost immediately, disaster struck, for the tide had not risen as expected. The coral reef that ringed Betio became an invisible barrier, stranding the Higgins boats hundreds of yards from shore. Engines roared and propellers churned, but the craft could move no further, trapped in water too shallow to advance. Inside the boats, Marines looked out in horror at the long distance between them and the beach. They would have to wade through chest-deep water, burdened with rifles, packs, and ammunition, while under fire. Commanders had feared such a scenario, and now it had come to pass. The landing, meant to be swift and overwhelming, was already unraveling before the first shot was fired. The Marines who climbed over the sides of stranded boats stepped into water that felt like a death trap. Their gear dragged them down, boots sinking into soft sand, rifles held above their heads to keep them dry. The distance to shore seemed endless, stretching across the open lagoon, under the eyes of hidden enemy gunners. Suddenly, the stillness shattered as Japanese machine guns opened fire from bunkers along the beach. Bullets hissed and snapped through the water, cutting down men before they had taken more than a few steps. Mortar shells splashed into the lagoon, sending fountains of spray into the air and scattering terrified Marines. Officers shouted for their men to keep moving, urging them forward through the deadly gauntlet. Some Marines discarded their packs in desperation, trying to lighten their load as bullets churned the water around them. The lagoon became a killing field, littered with bodies as the survivors pressed on grimly toward the shore. What had begun as an amphibious assault was turning into a massacre in the shallows. For those lucky enough to ride aboard amphibious tractors, the approach was no less harrowing. LVTs crawled slowly across the reef, their thin armor offering little protection against direct hits. Japanese gunners adjusted their aim, focusing on the noisy lumbering machines crossing the lagoon. Shells slammed into the tractors, blowing men apart, and sending burning wreckage sinking into the water. Others managed to reach the beach, only to find themselves facing seawalls bristling with hidden bunkers. Marines poured out of the vehicles and hugged the sand, their first objective simply to survive. Communication faltered amid the smoke and roar, units scattered as men were cut down before they could regroup. Some tractors, crippled by hits, stalled in the water, forcing their passengers to jump overboard and wade the rest of the way. The landing craft that survived pressed on doggedly, depositing their human cargo into hell itself. For the Marines of the first wave, survival became a matter of chance rather than skill. The Japanese defenders had been waiting silently, conserving their fire during the bombardment, and now they unleashed it with precision. Machine guns fired from cleverly hidden pillboxes, their slits invisible until tracer rounds spat from them. Artillery boomed from concealed positions, shells slamming into the water with devastating accuracy. Mortar crews rained bombs onto the lagoon, targeting clusters of men struggling forward in the surf. Every inch of the approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire, a deadly grid from which there was no escape. Admiral Shibasaki's prediction that 1,000,000 men cannot take Betio in 100 years seemed in that moment almost true. The Marines, exposed and vulnerable, had nowhere to hide, their only protection the shallow water around them. Yet even as men fell, others pressed forward, driven by training, duty, and sheer willpower. Each step was agony, each yard gained paid for with blood. The battle for Tarawa had truly begun in the lagoon, before a single Marine set foot on the beach. Onshore, The beaches themselves were narrow strips of sand pressed against seawalls of coral and sandbags. The Japanese had transformed these barriers into kill zones, funneling attackers into fields of concentrated fire. Behind the walls lay bunkers, trenches, and pillboxes, connected by tunnels and camouflaged paths. Gunners emerged, fired their bursts, and disappeared, making them almost impossible to silence. Heavy guns, mounted in concrete casemates, targeted both the lagoon and the approaching craft with murderous precision. The defenders had rehearsed this moment for months, and now their preparations paid grim dividends. Marines who reached the beach found no safe refuge, only a line of fire that seemed to come from every direction. Blood mixed with surf as bodies piled up against the seawalls, where survivors huddled for cover. Leaders shouted orders, but many units were already shattered and disorganized by the time they arrived. The first foothold on Betio was bought at the cost of staggering losses. Among the Marines themselves, chaos and courage mixed in equal measure. Corporals and sergeants rallied small groups of survivors, urging them forward through the storm of bullets. Riflemen fired blindly at the bunkers, their bullets sparking uselessly off reinforced walls. Flamethrower teams tried to advance, but were often cut down before reaching striking distance. Medics braved the fire to tend to the wounded, dragging bleeding men through surf already stained red. Officers led from the front, waving their men forward even as they themselves were shot down. Across the lagoon, acts of heroism unfolded in seconds. Men shielding comrades, charging machine guns, or simply refusing to fall back. For every Marine who collapsed in the water, another pressed on grimly, determined to reach the beach. Communication broke down, radios lost in the surf or destroyed by shellfire, leaving units to fight blind. Yet through it all, the Marines clung to their training and their will to fight. The price was high, but the assault pressed forward. The tide of battle in the lagoon revealed the brutal reality of amphibious warfare in the Pacific. Technology and firepower alone could not guarantee success against a determined and well-prepared enemy. The reef, underestimated in planning, had become the Marines' deadliest obstacle, turning landing craft into floating coffins. The Japanese, hidden and shielded, had prepared for exactly this moment, ensuring maximum casualties during the landing. Marines who had survived Guadalcanal were shocked by the ferocity of Betio's defenses. For new recruits, the lagoon was a baptism by fire, an introduction to war in its most unforgiving form. Commanders offshore watched through binoculars, horrified by the carnage unfolding before their eyes. Yet they could not halt the assault. To pull back would mean greater disaster. The plan had been set in motion, and now it had to be carried through. Tarawa was no longer an operation, it was a bloodbath. By the time the first waves reached the seawall, the beaches were littered with the dead, and the lagoon was choked with wreckage. Higgins' boats burned, amphibious tractors lay shattered, and the water shimmered red under the tropical sun. Survivors crouched behind the seawall, clinging to life as enemy fire raked over their heads. The landing had achieved its goal only in the barest sense. Marines had reached Betio, but at staggering cost. The Japanese still held their positions, their guns unbroken, their will unshaken. The Marines, scattered and bloodied, were now locked in a fight to claw their way inland, bunker by bunker. The bombardment that had promised to clear the way had failed, and the men paid the price in blood. Yet the beachhead existed, fragile though it was, and from it the assault would continue. The Marines had not been broken, though they were battered, and the fight for Tarawa was only just beginning. The reef at Betio was a natural fortress, stretching like a jagged barrier across the lagoon, just below the surface of the water. For centuries it had guarded the island from the waves. but in November 1943 it became a deadly ally to the Japanese defenders. The tide, miscalculated by American planners, remained stubbornly low, exposing the coral teeth that ripped the underbellies of Higgins' boats. Instead of gliding over as expected, landing craft ground to a halt, helpless and immovable, within range of the waiting guns. The plan had assumed speed and surprise, but the reef stole both before a single Marine touched the sand. Men stared over the sides of the stranded boats, realizing the distance they now had to cross under fire. The lagoon stretched ahead like a gauntlet of death, every step open to enemy machine guns. Already smoke and fire filled the air, the water shimmering red with the blood of the first fallen. In that moment, what had been an obstacle on a map became the decisive killer of men. The reef trap had sprung, and the Marines were caught in its jaws. Those who disembarked from stranded boats plunged into chest-deep water, their heavy packs dragging at their shoulders. Rifles were held aloft, awkwardly balanced as men struggled to wade forward against the current. Japanese gunners saw the silhouettes moving slowly through the water and began to fire with ruthless precision. Bullets skipped and ricocheted off the waves, cutting down Marines before they had gone 10 yards. Mortars landed among them, plumes of spray and shrapnel tearing gaps in the advancing lines. Men cried out as comrades fell beside them, yet the living pressed on, their survival instinct bound to duty. Some threw off gear to move faster, but without weapons or ammunition they were almost helpless when they reached shore. Officers shouted orders no one could hear above the roar of battle, their words lost in the wind and chaos. The lagoon, once tranquil, had become an open-air slaughterhouse. Progress measured in yards came only at the price of dozens of lives. Amphibious tractors, the only vehicles capable of crawling over the reef, bore the brunt of the attack. Their thin steel armor rattled under machine gun fire, sparks flying as bullets chewed through their frames. Japanese gunners shifted their aim, targeting the tractors as they crawled slowly toward the beaches. Explosions ripped through several, flames consuming both machine and men in a matter of seconds. Survivors leapt into the water, swimming frantically or dragging themselves toward the seawall. Others clung to wreckage, floating helplessly as shells splashed around them. Still, some tractors made it, their tracks grinding over coral and sand, delivering Marines directly into the teeth of the defenses. Each vehicle that reached shore represented dozens of men spared the deadly wade, but their numbers were far too few. For most Marines, the tractors were a distant hope quickly swallowed by fire and smoke. The reef had separated the lucky from the damned with cold indifference. As the morning wore on, the water itself became a graveyard of men and machines. Wrecked landing craft smoldered, their charred skeletons jutting above the tide like broken bones. Bodies floated among them, carried by currents toward the reef where waves broke over crimson foam. Ammunition boxes, helmets and rifles drifted beside the dead, evidence of an assault gone tragically wrong. Japanese gunners, hidden in pillboxes, kept up a relentless stream of fire, knowing the reef held the Marines helpless. The lagoon was supposed to shield the attackers, but instead it trapped them in full view of the defenders. Every advance was a crawl, every moment a gamble with death. Those who survived remembered the water turning thick with oil and blood, a place where survival meant ignoring the screams of drowning comrades. No cover existed, only the desperate instinct to keep moving forward. The reef was not simply an obstacle, it was a killing ground designed by nature and perfected by war. Among the Marines, acts of courage emerged amid the carnage. Men dragged wounded comrades through the surf, bullets snapping all around them. Some shielded others with their own bodies, sacrificing themselves so friends might live to reach the seawall. Flamethrower operators, weighed down with volatile fuel tanks, waded through the water despite being prime targets for Japanese gunners. Medics worked frantically in the shallows, binding wounds with bandages soaked instantly in blood. Communication had broken down completely, radios drowned or destroyed, leaving small groups to fight on instinct alone. Yet the discipline drilled into them at Guadalcanal and in training camps back home kept many pushing forward. The lagoon was no place for hesitation. A moment's pause could mean being cut down where one stood. Marines who had survived the initial waves now crawled behind debris for cover, firing at invisible enemies in hidden bunkers. They had come across thousands of miles of ocean to fight, and now the reef demanded payment. Each yard gained was written in blood, courage, and sacrifice. The Japanese defenders, watching through periscopes and narrow firing slits, could scarcely believe the advantage fortune had given them. They had prepared Betio as a fortress, but the reef made it into a perfect killing zone. Every hesitation, every stalled landing craft, gave them more time to reload, re-aim, and slaughter the invaders. Mortar crews worked with precision, adjusting their fire to catch clusters of Marines in the lagoon. Machine gunners traversed slowly, sweeping arcs of death across the shallow waters. Their officers urged them on, reminding them that one enemy killed in the lagoon meant one less at the seawall. Ammunition was plentiful, supplies stockpiled deep in bunkers safe from the naval bombardment. The defenders knew they could not hope to survive indefinitely, but for now the balance of power was theirs. The reef had given them hours of opportunity to inflict catastrophic losses. The atoll was becoming not just a battlefield, but a butcher's yard. For commanders offshore, the unfolding scene was one of horror and helplessness. Admiral Turner watched through binoculars as wave after wave faltered in the lagoon. Signals flew between ships, but there was little they could do to alter the tide or erase the reef. Naval gunfire had already shifted inland, leaving the lagoon uncovered in the crucial moments of landing. Airstrikes came too late to suppress the bunkers that now spat fire across the shallows. Officers on the command ships clenched their fists as they realized their men were being slaughtered before they could even fight. Some considered aborting the landings, but to retreat under fire would only double the disaster. The Marines were already committed, their bodies in the water, their lives hanging by a thread. The reef had rendered months of planning useless in a single stroke of nature. Tarawa was no longer a textbook operation. It was a desperate struggle for survival. By midday, the reef had earned its grim place in history as one of the deadliest traps in the Pacific War. Hundreds of Marines lay dead in the lagoon, their bodies drifting with the tide or pinned against coral by waves. Survivors crouched behind the seawall, too few in number to launch the overwhelming assault originally envisioned. Equipment was lost, units scattered, and momentum shattered. Yet the Marines refused to break. They had been trained for perseverance, and now that training was their only shield against despair. Slowly, painfully, they began clawing their way inland, bunker by bunker, trench by trench. The reef would forever be remembered by survivors as the place where plans failed and men's willpower was tested. What was meant to be an obstacle of minutes had become a killing ground of hours. Yet despite all, the Marines had established a foothold, tenuous but real, and from that fragile grip on the sand, the battle for Betio would continue. By mid-morning on November 20th, the Marines who had survived the deadly wade through the lagoon finally pressed themselves against Betio's seawall. The barrier of sandbags and coral, rising chest-high, provided the first real cover from the Japanese guns. But here too, death waited, as enemy fire swept just inches above their helmets. Dozens of Marines crouched together in the narrow strip, water lapping at their boots, blood mingling with sand. Units that had landed together were now scattered, broken into small knots of survivors with no clear command. Officers searched desperately for familiar faces, shouting above the roar of guns to rally anyone within earshot. Medics worked frantically, pulling wounded men against the wall, bandaging them under relentless fire. Equipment was ruined, rifles clogged with sand and water, radios smashed beyond repair in the surf. Ammunition ran low, as men fired short bursts at unseen bunkers, hoping to keep the enemy's heads down. The beachhead existed, but it was fragile, desperate, and bleeding. Every attempt to move beyond the seawall brought new waves of casualties. Japanese pillboxes, hidden in the palm groves and bunkers inland, fired through narrow slits with murderous precision. Marines, who tried to scale the wall, were cut down instantly, their bodies tumbling back into their comrades below. Machine guns scythed the sand, bullets cracking like whips as they ricocheted through the thin cover. Mortars dropped steadily onto the beach, turning small groups of huddled men into mangled heaps in seconds. The seawall became both a shield and a trap, offering protection but pinning the Marines in place. The plan had been to surge inland with speed and momentum, but instead the assault bogged down in chaos. Men whispered to one another, wondering if they would ever get off the beach alive. Commanders knew if the Marines stayed here too long, the entire assault risked annihilation. Betio's sands had become a crucible of fire, testing their will to endure. Scattered leadership kept the fight from collapsing completely. Colonel David Shoup, despite being wounded early in the landing, established himself at the edge of the lagoon to direct the battle. Calm and determined, he shouted orders, reorganized scattered Marines, and sent runners to gather fragments of shattered companies. His courage, visible to those around him, steadied men who were close to breaking under the relentless fire. Junior officers and sergeants took it upon themselves to rally small groups, urging them to prepare for a push inland. Without radios or reliable communications, coordination came from shouted commands and hand signals. Some squads dug shallow scrapes in the sand, clinging to whatever cover they could manage with their helmets and shovels. Others stripped ammunition from the dead, passing it forward to those who still had working rifles. Leadership by example kept the line intact when the battle seemed ready to unravel. The fragile beachhead survived hour by hour through grit and determination. The physical conditions of the beach made survival even harder. The sand was churned into muck by artillery and men, stained with oil from burning wrecks and dark with blood. Smoke from shattered landing craft drifted inland, stinging eyes and choking lungs. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly, turning helmets into furnaces and draining what little strength the men had left. Corpses littered the waterline, some floating in with the tide, others sprawled half buried in sand. The smell of cordite, smoke, and death hung heavy in the air, thick enough to taste. Marines fought not only the enemy, but exhaustion, dehydration, and despair in those first brutal hours. Every movement drew fire, every attempt to rise above the seawall threatened instant death. The beach became an open wound, raw and unrelenting, where time seemed frozen in a haze of survival. And yet, even in that misery, men prepared to attack again. There was no other choice but forward. Small groups of Marines began probing gaps in the seawall, searching for places to push through. Flamethrower teams crawled forward, their heavy tanks sloshing, determined to burn out pillboxes one at a time. Engineers carried satchel charges, clutched their chests as they dashed across open sand to blast bunkers apart. Riflemen covered them as best they could, firing bursts at narrow gun slits where muzzle flashes betrayed the enemy. Each success came at terrible cost, with entire teams sometimes wiped out before reaching their targets. Yet when one bunker fell silent, it created a crack in the Japanese defense that others could exploit. Slowly the beachhead began to creep forward, measured in feet rather than yards. Marines learned to leapfrog one another, covering with suppressive fire while comrades advanced with explosives. Leadership shifted to those who dared to move first, inspiring others to follow. The struggle was inch by inch, but every inch gained was a victory. Meanwhile, reinforcements struggled across the lagoon, only to find themselves pinned alongside their comrades. Waves of Marines arriving later in the morning piled up behind the seawall, compounding the congestion and chaos. Higgins' boats still burned on the reef, their wrecks marking the path of failure across the water. Amphibious tractors arrived sporadically, riddled with holes, their passengers shaken but alive. The influx of fresh men gave strength to the foothold, but also made it more precarious under constant shelling. More bodies meant more targets, and Japanese gunners focused their fire on the dense clusters of Marines. Still, the growing numbers offered hope, as officers organized new pushes inland with these reserves. The men already ashore, exhausted and bloodied, welcomed reinforcements with grim relief. The weight of the assault was finally beginning to match the scale of the defense, but for every gain, the enemy exacted a savage toll. The Japanese showed no sign of weakening in those first hours. Their bunkers remained intact, their trenches connected, and their morale unbroken. Shibasaki's special naval landing forces had prepared for this moment, rehearsing their defense until it became second nature. They knew every inch of the island, every field of fire, every blind spot to exploit. Machine guns spat ceaselessly, mortars thumped, and snipers picked off Marines who dared expose themselves. From deep within concrete casemates, artillery thundered, shells smashing into the shallows, where more Marines tried to land. The defenders had survived the bombardment, and now wielded their positions like knives pressed to the throats of the invaders. For the Japanese, the seawall was not a defensive line but a killing floor. They had promised to hold Betio to the last man, and in those hours it seemed they would. The Marines faced not only a fortress, but a fanatical determination to kill every last intruder. As night approached on the first day, the Marines still clung to their precarious foothold on Betio. Hundreds lay dead in the lagoon. Hundreds more sprawled lifeless along the seawall. Survivors huddled in shallow scrapes, clutching rifles, flamethrowers, or grenades, waiting for the next assault. Officers pieced together plans by flashlight, mapping out new attacks for the following morning. Ammunition and supplies trickled ashore, carried by men braving the reef under fire. The Japanese showed no intention of yielding, their fire never slackening even as darkness fell. The beachhead was secure only in the most fragile sense. It existed, but could be erased with one strong counterattack. Yet the Marines had proven something crucial. They had not been driven back into the sea. Despite chaos, carnage, and despair, they held on, bloodied but unbroken. The crisis of the beachhead marked the beginning of Tarawa's legend, a tale written in fire and sacrifice. Amid the carnage of Betio's beaches, moments of extraordinary valor lit the darkness of war. Men who had waded through the killing lagoon now found themselves pinned against sea walls under unrelenting fire. In that crucible, courage revealed itself in the actions of ordinary Marines who refused to yield. Engineers crawled forward with satchel charges, their bodies pressed low as bullets hissed overhead. Each step was agony, each yard a test of nerve, yet they kept moving toward the pillboxes. One explosion after another tore open Japanese positions, creating precious gaps for riflemen to exploit. Flamethrower teams followed, their jets of fire turning bunkers into infernos. Every act of destruction meant survival, for comrades still trapped against the wall. Heroism was not planned, but born from the brutal necessity of survival, and on Betio it became the currency by which progress was bought. Leadership played its part in keeping men moving when despair threatened to root them in place. Colonel David Shoup, bleeding from a leg wound, refused evacuation, setting up a command post under fire. His calm voice and clear orders gave the scattered Marines a sense of purpose in the chaos. Junior officers, often just out of college, shouted encouragement as they dashed across open sand. Many fell in the attempt, but their example inspired others to surge forward after them. Sergeants and corporals became the anchors of small units, rallying half a dozen survivors to press the attack. These leaders fought as much with presence as with bullets, embodying the will to endure. Their men clung to their courage as a lifeline, finding strength in the sight of someone still standing. Without such figures, the beachhead would have collapsed into confusion and retreat. With them, the Marines inched forward against impossible odds. Individual stories of heroism carried the day, each act tipping the balance in small but vital ways. Corporal William Bordelon, a combat engineer, charged repeatedly into the open to destroy Japanese strongpoints. Despite being wounded, he continued to haul satchel charges and demolish bunkers until he was finally killed. His sacrifice allowed dozens of Marines to move inland, breaking a deadly stalemate. Elsewhere, flamethrower operators risked instant death by carrying tanks of volatile fuel across open ground. Their streams of fire turned the interiors of pillboxes into charred ruins, silencing machine guns that had pinned men for hours. Medics, armed only with courage, darted into the surf to pull wounded comrades to safety. Each small act of defiance against death stitched together the survival of the beachhead. These stories, whispered later among survivors, became the legends of Tarawa. On the sand, they were the difference between annihilation and endurance. The terrain itself magnified the need for individual courage. The narrow beaches offered no cover, only the seawall and scattered debris from wrecked landing craft. Every movement inland meant exposure to guns hidden in palm groves and concrete bunkers. Sand-clogged rifles, radios were useless, and communications relied on shouted words and hand signals. In this chaos, decisions were made in seconds by men who had no time to consult orders. A Marine sprinting across open ground to throw a grenade could change the fate of a platoon. An engineer with a flamethrower could silence a bunker holding up hundreds of men. Every action was magnified, every failure punished instantly by death. Heroism was not optional, it was survival written in fire and blood. On Betio's sands, courage was the only shield against annihilation. The Japanese defenders, for their part, recognized the bravery of the enemy they faced. From their fortified positions, they saw Marines advancing into fire with reckless determination. Machine gunners reported astonishment at men who continued forward even as comrades fell beside them. Mortar crews, firing ceaselessly, watched in disbelief as survivors dragged wounded through the surf. Shibasaki's men understood that their enemy would not stop, no matter the cost. This realization hardened their resolve, fueling the ferocity with which they fought back. To them, every Marine who advanced was a threat that had to be killed. Yet they also knew that the enemy's courage was steadily eroding their defenses. Each bunker destroyed, each pillbox silenced, was a step closer to collapse. For both sides, heroism was not abstract but immediate, measured in blood spilled on coral sand. The Marines who survived that first day carried the scars of what they had witnessed. They spoke of comrades who charged into fire, knowing they would not return. They remembered engineers dragging explosives forward with trembling hands, only to vanish in blasts that tore open bunkers. They recalled officers rallying men by sheer presence, standing tall in the storm of bullets. Many swore that without those acts of courage, none of them would have survived the beaches. In the midst of slaughter, heroism became a contagion, spreading from one Marine to the next. When one man rose, others followed, refusing to let him fight alone. Survival was communal, but it depended on individuals daring to lead. These memories haunted them for the rest of their lives, etched into their minds as vividly as the gunfire. Tarawa's sands were littered with death, but also with the proof of courage under fire. Recognition came later, when the scale of sacrifice was finally tallied. Medals of honor and Navy crosses were awarded to those whose actions had stood above even the chaos of Tarawa. Families at home received the news of loved ones lost but honored as heroes. Newspapers described the landing as one of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history, yet also one of the most valorous. The names of men like Bordelon became etched into the legacy of the Corps. But on the beach itself, recognition was meaningless, for the fight was far from over. Survivors pressed forward into the interior, carrying with them the lessons of courage born on the sand. Every bunker destroyed created the chance for new heroism, as Marines faced challenges just as deadly inland. Valor was not a single moment, but a chain linking together across hours of battle. At Tarawa, those chains forged the survival of the entire division. As night fell over Betio, the sands were thick with the proof of heroism and sacrifice. Marines huddled in shallow foxholes or behind wreckage, preparing to continue the fight at dawn. The Japanese still held the majority of the island, their bunkers intact and their firepower formidable. Yet the foothold had endured because individuals had refused to let it collapse. The cost was terrible, with hundreds dead and wounded, but the will of the Marines had not broken. The first day at Tarawa was remembered as a nightmare of blood, chaos, and impossible courage. Those who survived knew they had witnessed acts that defied description, men rising above fear in the face of certain death. The beachhead had not been lost, and that was owed to the heroes of the sand. Their deeds, carved into the memory of comrades, became the foundation of the Marine Corps' legend. Tarawa had shown the world what courage under fire truly meant. By the second day on Betio, the battle had shifted from the lagoon and seawall into the fortress heart of the island. The Japanese strongpoints, untouched by bombardment, still dominated the beaches with interlocking arcs of fire. To move inland, the Marines had to destroy each bunker, trench, and pillbox one by one. These were no simple obstacles but concrete chambers, reinforced with coconut logs, earth, and steel. Machine gunners fired through narrow slits, almost impossible to hit from the outside. Mortar pits hidden beneath camouflage hurled shells in steady rhythm onto every advance. The Marines quickly realized that only fire, explosives, and brute courage could silence these fortresses. Rifle fire was useless against walls that shrugged off even direct hits from tanks. Survival meant closing to within yards of the enemy, often face to face in the smoke and dust. The bunker fighting had begun, and it would define the rest of the battle. Flamethrowers became the most feared and effective weapons in the Marine arsenal. Operators crept forward on their bellies, the heavy tanks of pressurized fuel clanking against their backs. Covering riflemen sprayed suppressive fire at the bunker slits to keep defenders pinned inside. When the flamethrower roared, A jet of fire spewed into the pillbox, igniting everything in its path. The effect was instant and horrific, with defenders either incinerated or forced to flee into waiting gunfire. Yet flamethrower teams were also prime targets, and many were shot down before they could fire. The weapon's range was short, forcing operators to expose themselves in the open. Their courage in advancing under withering fire saved countless comrades trapped on the beaches. Each bunker reduced by flame meant one less machine gun to rake the Marines. Fire was now the tool of survival, and it turned Betio into a furnace of war. Engineers carried satchel charges, thick bags packed with explosives, into the deadly maze of trenches and bunkers. Crawling across open sand, they dashed forward with charges clutched to their chests. A swift toss or placement against a bunker wall turned concrete into rubble in seconds. The blasts ripped apart coconut log defenses, sending shock waves through the dug-in enemy. Sometimes the charges were dropped directly into firing slits, annihilating the crews inside instantly. Engineers often worked in pairs, one man hauling explosives, the other providing cover with a rifle or carbine. Many died within yards of their targets, but those who succeeded opened vital paths inland. Marines learned to coordinate, sending in flamethrowers and satchel charges together to maximize destruction. These brutal methods became routine, repeated dozens of times as the day wore on. Every charge placed and every bunker silenced brought them closer to control of the island. Grenades and bayonets became tools of necessity in the close-quarter nightmare. Marines hurled grenades into trenches, diving for cover as the blasts shook the ground. Shrapnel tore through Japanese positions, clearing the way for assault teams to storm in. Bayonet charges followed, men plunging steel into shadows where defenders still clung to life. The fighting was intimate, savage, and personal, carried out at distances measured in feet. In some cases, Marines grappled hand-to-hand, knives and rifle butts replacing rifles and carbines. Japanese defenders fought with equal ferocity, emerging suddenly from tunnels to launch counterattacks. Suicide charges, with grenades clutched to their chests, claimed more Marine lives even as the defenders fell. The brutality of the fighting shocked even hardened Guadalcanal veterans, who had never seen such concentrated resistance. Betio's bunkers forced both sides into a cycle of attack and counterattack without mercy. Survival was measured by the last man standing inside a trench. Tanks rumbled ashore and joined the brutal clearing operations, their guns pounding bunker after bunker. The Marines guided them forward through wreckage and debris, often under fire themselves. Sherman tanks blasted concrete strongpoints, their high explosive shells cracking defenses the infantry could not breach alone. Some tanks became stuck in craters or bogged in sand, where Japanese soldiers swarmed them with grenades and satchel charges. Crewmen fought desperately, firing machine guns in every direction to keep attackers at bay. Coordination between tank and infantry was difficult amid smoke, confusion, and broken communications. Yet when the armor worked, the effect was devastating, silencing multiple strongpoints in minutes. The tanks gave the Marines momentum, pushing the fight deeper into the heart of Betio. With every bunker destroyed, the defenders' firepower diminished, but the cost remained staggering. The battle for each 100 yards was paid in blood and steel. The Japanese defenders fought with fanatic determination. Their orders clear: no retreat, no surrender. They fought from tunnels, popping up unexpectedly behind advancing Marines to strike from the rear. Snipers concealed in wreckage picked off flamethrower teams before they could fire. Entire squads of defenders sometimes stayed silent in bunkers until Marines passed, then erupted in a sudden ambush. Machine gun crews replaced fallen men instantly, the guns never silent until the position itself was destroyed. The defenders knew their fate was sealed, but intended to make the enemy pay dearly. Each bunker became a miniature Alamo, defended to the last man with grenades, rifles, and bayonets. For the Marines, progress was measured in blood, for no position was abandoned willingly. The battle took on a rhythm of slaughter, each bunker destroyed only after desperate resistance. Betio was less a battlefield than a charnel house, where courage and death met in every trench. Acts of valor lit the grimness of the fight. Flamethrower operators, knowing they were marked men, advanced any way to pour fire into pillboxes. Engineers crawled across bullet-swept sand to hurl charges that saved entire platoons from annihilation. Riflemen shielded comrades with their own bodies, firing until they themselves fell. Officers rallied shattered groups of men, leading charges with pistols drawn against bunkers spewing fire. Medics darted between trenches, dragging the wounded out of hell, sometimes only to be killed in the attempt. Each story of bravery became part of the collective will that kept the assault moving. Marines spoke later of comrades who rose when no one else could, turning fear into momentum. The human cost was immense, but without such acts, the battle would have ended in failure. The sands of Betio became not just a graveyard, but a monument to courage under fire. Heroism was the thread that stitched survival into victory. By nightfall of the second day, the Marines had carved a bloody path into the heart of Betio. Hundreds of bunkers lay shattered, their ruins smouldering from fire and explosives. The island, once a fortress of interlocking guns, was now pockmarked with smoking craters and twisted wreckage. Marines huddled in captured positions, exhausted, filthy, and haunted by what they had endured. The Japanese defenders, though still holding pockets of resistance, had been pushed back into ever smaller corners. The fight was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. The methods of fire and steel, flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades and bayonets had broken the backbone of the defense. The cost was measured in thousands of lives, but the beachhead had become a foothold inland. Tarawa was no longer just a landing, it was now a battle of annihilation, and in the bunkers, the fate of the island was being decided. The battle for Betio became a war of inches. Every advance purchased with lives that could never be replaced. Marines who had survived the lagoon and seawall now faced a labyrinth of bunkers and trenches, each defended with fanatical resolve. The island was barely 2 miles long, yet it felt like a continent of death. Every coconut log shelter demanding blood. A single machine gun hidden behind sand and timber could halt an entire company for hours. Engineers and flamethrower teams were called again and again, their work critical but often suicidal. Every attempt to breach a pillbox meant men crawling across open sand, exposed to fire that cut them down mercilessly. Success was measured not in sweeping maneuvers, but in the silence that followed a destroyed bunker. Marines learned to fight in pairs and trios, improvising tactics in the chaos of smoke and gunfire. By late afternoon, men no longer spoke of taking the island quickly, but simply surviving long enough to advance. Tarawa had revealed itself as a battlefield where victory was ground out 1 yard at a time. The Japanese fortifications seemed endless, a web of interlocking positions designed to bleed attackers dry. Coconut logs stacked 3 deep absorbed rifle fire and even deflected grenades. Concrete pillboxes, barely visible above the sand, spat bullets with mechanical precision. Trenches connected bunkers into a single living organism of defense, allowing defenders to retreat and counterattack at will. Marines who stormed one position often found themselves enfiladed by another, hidden just yards away. Mortars thumped from behind the lines, raining shells onto concentrations of men caught in the open. The defenders had prepared every angle, every field of fire, with ruthless foresight. The result was a battlefield where nothing came cheaply, where every movement forward was punished. Marines fought not only the enemy, but the suffocating realization that each bunker had to be taken at full cost. Betio was not simply defended, it was engineered to consume lives. For the Marines, exhaustion became as lethal as enemy fire. They fought through sand churned into muck, their uniforms stiff with sweat, seawater, and blood. The tropical sun beat down on helmets that felt like furnaces, baking the men as they crawled forward. Water was scarce, canteens lost in the lagoon, or emptied in the first hours of fighting. Hunger gnawed at bellies, but there was no time for food, only bullets and grenades passed forward. Communication was fragmentary, orders often delivered by runners who risked their lives crossing open ground. Units were shattered, men from different companies thrown together into makeshift squads. In this chaos, sergeants and corporals became the backbone, leading attacks on bunkers with whatever men they could gather. Each assault drained what little strength the Marines had left, but failure meant being pinned under fire forever. Fatigue pressed down like a second enemy, and still the advance continued. The island itself magnified the struggle, its geography offering no mercy to the attackers. Betio's width was never more than a few hundred yards, leaving no room for maneuver. Palm trees splintered into jagged stumps offered no cover, only obstacles that slowed the advance. Craters from the naval bombardment became shallow shelters, but they were also death traps under mortar fire. Sand clogged weapons, forcing men to clear rifles again and again under fire. The smell of rotting corpses, both Marine and Japanese, filled the air, clinging to every breath. Wreckage from landing craft and tanks littered the shoreline, transformed into cover for both sides. Marines described the battlefield as a furnace, its heat and smoke pressing against their lungs with every step. The ground seemed alive with fire, every yard contested as if it were the last. Betio was less an island than a crucible, burning away the strength of those who fought upon it. The land itself demanded a toll in blood for every foot gained. The Japanese fought with a resolve that turned every defensive position into a miniature battle of annihilation. Machine gun crews replaced fallen comrades without hesitation, keeping their weapons firing until the very end. Grenade-armed defenders leapt from trenches to rush Marines, detonating themselves in suicidal charges. Snipers, hidden in shattered palm trunks, waited patiently to pick off flamethrower operators and officers. Mortar crews fired until their positions were overrun, sometimes choosing to die beside their weapons. Even when surrounded, many defenders refused to surrender, fighting until silenced by fire or explosives. Each bunker seemed to embody Shibasaki's command to hold Betio to the last man. For Marines, this meant no easy victories, no sudden collapse of resistance. Every defender killed represented an ordeal of blood and fire for the attackers. Betio was not defended passively, but with fanatical energy that turned the island into a grinder of men. Amid this slaughter, the Marines adapted their tactics to the grim reality of Betio. Flamethrowers and satchel charges became the instruments of progress, paired with covering rifle fire. Marines learned to advance in small groups, crawling forward while comrades laid down suppressive bursts. Grenades were thrown in waves, clearing trenches before men stormed them with bayonets. Tanks, when they could move, blasted bunkers at point-blank range to break the stalemate. Engineers tunneled through sand with explosives, blowing apart fortifications from underneath. Every assault was coordinated in seconds, decisions made on instinct by leaders at the front. Success was often measured in silence. The sudden absence of gunfire from a pillbox. Marines pushed forward bunker by bunker, trench by trench, leaving trails of destruction in their wake. Their advance was not swift, but it was relentless, fueled by necessity and survival. Betio was teaching the Marines a brutal new art of amphibious warfare. The cost was staggering, and the Marines felt it with every step they took inland. Comrades fell beside them, sometimes in silence, sometimes with final screams drowned by gunfire. Wounded men cried for medics, who risked everything to drag them to cover under constant fire. Cordmen worked with trembling hands, binding wounds in the sand, often killed themselves before finishing their work. Marines stripped ammunition and grenades from the fallen, knowing they would need every round to live. The ground was littered with bodies, uniforms torn, and faces unrecognizable, lying where they had fallen. Each yard gained was marked by death, as if the island itself demanded sacrifice for progress. Yet the Marines pressed on, their determination unshaken despite the carnage around them. They knew that to falter was to die, pinned forever on the beachhead. Survival meant pushing forward, no matter the cost. Tarawa's progress was measured in blood, not in maps. By the end of the second day, the Marines had carved out a fragile line across the island, but at a terrible price. Hundreds lay dead in the sand, their bodies mute testimony to the cost of every advance. The Japanese still held strong points, their defenses reduced but far from destroyed. The Marines were exhausted, battered, and bloodied, yet they had not stopped moving forward. Each bunker silenced, each trench captured, had been bought with courage and sacrifice. The beachhead was no longer on the brink of collapse, but the fight was far from over. Tarawa was proving itself to be one of the bloodiest tests the Marine Corps had ever faced. Every yard won reminded them of the comrades who would never see home again. The cost was almost unbearable, but it was the only way to victory. On Betio, every inch of ground was a battlefield unto itself. Rear Admiral K.G. Shibasaki had vowed that 1,000,000 men could not take Betio in 100 years, and his men clung to that prophecy. His command post was buried deep within a reinforced blockhouse at the heart of the island, shielded by layers of sand and concrete. From here he had directed the opening defense, calmly coordinating fire from bunkers and mortars. But on the second day of fighting, American shells rained down with relentless fury, pounding every known strongpoint. One lucky hit struck near his command bunker, collapsing part of the structure and shattering communications. Shibasaki was fatally wounded, though his men did not learn the full truth until later. Without his leadership, messages went unanswered, and surviving officers acted on their own initiative. Yet his death did not diminish the resolve of his garrison. It inflamed it. They believed his spirit demanded they fight to the last man, fulfilling his vow in blood. Betio was now to be defended as a tomb. The Japanese defenders, cut off from coordination, reverted to local command, each bunker becoming a war unto itself. Platoon leaders rallied their men with cries of defiance, determined to hold even as Marines closed in from every side. Communication lines severed by bombardment left units isolated, but this only hardened their resolve. With no expectation of relief, the defenders understood their role as sacrificial. Many clutched letters from home, tucked inside their uniforms, reminders of the families they would never see again. Machine gun nests fired until barrels warped, crews passing water over glowing metal to keep weapons alive. Mortar crews fired at any movement, adjusting aim by instinct and the screams of their enemies. Snipers in palm stumps and shattered blockhouses continued their deadly vigil, striking at exposed officers and flamethrower men. For the Marines, each step forward was contested by enemies who refused surrender. The battlefield became a mosaic of isolated last stands. Even as their situation became hopeless, Japanese soldiers clung to Shibasaki's orders with fanatical intensity. Some scrawled messages of loyalty on scraps of wood or torn cloth, leaving them in bunkers before their final charge. At night, defenders crept forward through the wreckage, launching banzai attacks that slashed into Marine lines. Screaming warriors burst from the shadows with rifles, bayonets, and grenades, often cut down but occasionally breaking through. Marines slept in shallow foxholes with one eye open, bayonets fixed and fingers on triggers. Corpsmen worked in the dark, pulling the wounded to safety under the constant threat of sudden assault. Machine gun crews set up fields of fire through the wreckage, cutting down attackers who ran headlong into death. But for every failed charge, another rose, driven by the conviction that death in battle was their only honor. The line between organized defense and ritual sacrifice blurred into one. Shibasaki's spirit seemed to command them from beyond the grave. The toll on the Marines was staggering, as the Japanese fought from positions that seemed indestructible. Each bunker had to be reduced with flamethrowers, demolitions, or point-blank tank fire, often after hours of combat. Satchel charges shook the earth as engineers crawled under fire to place explosives at firing slits. When smoke cleared, defenders who survived charged forward in suicidal rushes, bayonets flashing in the sand. Marines spoke of the uncanny courage of their enemies, who chose death with unnerving calm. One Marine later recalled, "They were like ghosts. You thought they were gone, then suddenly they were on top of you." The fighting was intimate, brutal, and without reprieve, conducted at distances measured in feet. Grenades exploded in trenches filled with men, locked in hand-to-hand struggle. Blood stained the sand red, mingling with seawater and oil from burning wreckage. Tarawa had become not just a battle, but a slaughterhouse. When news of Shibasaki's death spread among his men, it was received not with despair, but grim acceptance. To them, their admiral's fall confirmed their fate. None would leave the island alive. Surviving officers told their troops that their commander now watched over them, demanding they hold until the very end. For some, this became a spiritual mission, an oath to follow their leader into death. Men tied white headbands around their foreheads, symbols of their determination to die with honor. Ammunition was conserved, fired only at certain range, then spent in frenzied bursts at close quarters. Bayonets were sharpened, swords polished, grenades clutched in trembling hands. There was no longer a question of victory, only of how many Marines they could kill before falling. This grim fatalism gave the defenders a terrifying strength, born not from hope, but from the certainty of doom. Betio had become their graveyard, and they embraced it. For the Marines, the relentless defense was a revelation of what lay ahead in the Pacific War. They had expected resistance, but not such fanatical refusal to surrender. Officers realized that each fortified atoll would demand the same or greater sacrifice. Tarawa was proving that every battle in the Central Pacific would be fought bunker by bunker, trench by trench, to the last man. The cost was already measured in hundreds of Marine dead and thousands wounded, their bodies scattered across a mile-long strip of sand. Yet there was no retreat, No alternative but to push forward until the island was secured. Flamethrowers exhausted their fuel tanks, engineers scoured for more charges, and riflemen carried weapons that grew hot in their hands. Tanks lumbered forward, despite broken tracks, each shot from their guns tearing apart another stronghold. The battle had become mechanical, grinding, a relentless cycle of advance and annihilation. Tarawa was teaching lessons written in blood. As the third day dawned, Japanese resistance dwindled to scattered pockets, but each fought with undiminished fury. Marines advanced cautiously, clearing positions with grenades and flamethrowers before daring to enter. Survivors of the garrison chose not to hide, but to fight until the very end. Some emerged from bunkers with hands raised, only to pull concealed grenades in final acts of defiance. Others charged tanks bare-handed, leaping onto hulls with explosives strapped to their bodies. Marines hardened by 2 days of slaughter found themselves stunned by the sheer resolve of their enemies. One officer later wrote, "They would rather burn alive in their holes than raise a white flag." By evening the defenders were reduced to small groups, huddled in ruined blockhouses or shattered trenches. Still they fought on, as if each man carried Shibasaki's unfulfilled vow within him. Betio was consuming the last of its defenders in fire and sand. By the time the battle ended, nearly every Japanese defender lay dead, their bodies littering the island alongside the fallen Marines. Shibasaki's prophecy had lasted only 3 days, but his men had carried it out with dreadful fidelity. The admiral himself lay buried beneath the rubble of his command post, a symbol of defiance even in death. For the Marines, the victory came at a price so high it shook the entire American public when news emerged. More than 1,000 Marines had fallen, and 2,000 more were wounded, their sacrifice matched by the annihilation of the defenders. The Japanese had fought exactly as Shibasaki had promised, to the last man. Betio had been transformed from a nameless atoll into a symbol of what the Pacific War had become. Every yard of ground had been bought with blood, every bunker a grave. In the end, Shibasaki's last stand became the measure of Tarawa's horror. His prophecy was broken, but his spirit lingered in the sand. As the sun sank below the horizon on November 21st, 1943, the shattered island of Betio plunged into a darkness thick with dread. The Marines, bloodied and exhausted, dug shallow foxholes in sand, still warm with fire and flesh. Their tenuous lines stretched thin, weaving across shell-pocked ground and half-destroyed bunkers. Everywhere men clutched rifles and bayonets, whispering orders and listening for the faintest sound. The island was eerily quiet for a time, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the distant crash of surf. But silence was a mask, hiding the violence preparing to erupt under cover of night. The Japanese defenders, leaderless yet unbroken, had sworn to fight until none remained. They prepared for their final act with grenades, rifles, and sharpened bayonets, binding headbands of white cloth across their brows. For the Marines, the night would not bring rest. It would bring a storm of shadows. Betio's darkness became a battlefield more terrifying than daylight. Japanese soldiers crept through wreckage, crawling low across sand slick with blood, their silhouettes barely visible in moonlight. They knew their positions would not last another day, so they sought to inflict maximum death before dawn. In groups of 10 or 20, they whispered prayers and made silent gestures of farewell before charging forward. Some carried satchel charges strapped to their chests, intent on hurling themselves into marine foxholes. Others advanced with swords drawn, relics of samurai heritage made lethal in close quarters. Mortars and machine guns had been silenced, but bayonets and grenades needed no ammunition supply. Their cries of "Banzai" suddenly shattered the night, chilling Marines to the bone as human waves emerged from darkness. Rifle fire crackled, muzzle flashes, lighting fleeting glimpses of charging figures. Marines met the onslaught with fixed bayonets and grenades of their own, fighting in savage, intimate violence. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, illuminated only by bursts of fire and screams. The first counterattacks fell hardest on the fragile marine perimeter near the lagoon side of the island. Defenders there had dug in hastily, their foxholes barely deep enough to shield against grenades. When Japanese fighters hurled themselves into the line, hand-to-hand combat erupted instantly. Rifle butts smashed against skulls, bayonets pierced bodies, and men grappled in the sand like primal warriors. Corpses piled up in trenches, Marines and Japanese tangled together in death. A flamethrower crew ignited a bunker, flames roaring into the night, casting dancing shadows across the beach. The smell of burning flesh drifted with the sea breeze, mingling with the acrid stench of cordite. Marines fired blindly at movement, sometimes striking comrades in the confusion of darkness. Officers shouted desperately to maintain order, voices drowned in the madness of battle. The line bent, wavered, but through sheer resolve it held. In the center of the island, another furious banzai attack struck where the Marines had paused their advance earlier that day. A cluster of Japanese survivors surged forward, grenades in hand, throwing themselves into foxholes with suicidal determination. Explosions ripped men apart, showering sand and blood over stunned defenders. Marines scrambled for weapons, knives flashing in frantic, close-quarter struggle. A machine gun crew swung their weapon to rake the charging line, cutting swaths through the attackers until the barrel glowed. Still they came, leaping over corpses, screaming defiance as they pressed against the living wall. A Marine officer later recalled, "It was like fighting shadows that would not die." When dawn's light finally touched the field, the ground was littered with bodies, every inch contested. Survivors of the night stared in disbelief at the sheer number of dead. The Japanese had embraced death as a weapon, and the Marines had endured it. For many Marines, the night of terror became the most haunting memory of Tarawa. Men remembered the eerie moments before each attack, the silence broken only by whispers of surf and the rustle of movement. Then came the sudden eruption, screams of banzai, followed by the sickening clash of steel and flesh. Some Marines found themselves wrestling with opponents in darkness, their faces inches apart, breath mingling in the struggle for life. Knives and entrenching tools became weapons of survival when rifles jammed or ammunition ran dry. Corpsmen crawled through fire to treat the wounded, dragging men from foxholes as grenades exploded around them. Illumination flares fired from ships offshore briefly turned night into day, revealing surreal tableau of carnage. Marines saw their comrades locked in mortal combat. Then darkness returned, leaving only cries and gunfire. Many later admitted they felt fear like never before, even hardened veterans of Guadalcanal. Tarawa's night of terror became seared into their souls. Japanese tactics during the night were both desperate and cunning, designed to exploit the Marines' thin lines. Small groups infiltrated between foxholes, cutting down isolated men before slipping into the shadows. Others targeted officers and radio operators, hoping to disrupt communication and sow panic. In some places, infiltrators crept into Marine positions, stabbing sleeping men before being gunned down themselves. The psychological strain on the defenders was immense, every rustle of palm leaves or whisper of surf raising alarms. Marines fired at shadows, wasting ammunition, but unable to restrain their nerves. Some recalled feeling hunted, as if the island itself conspired to deliver death from the dark. Yet discipline prevailed in most sectors, as sergeants barked orders and men tightened their grips on rifles. Slowly, the Americans adapted, setting overlapping fields of fire and using flares more effectively. The Japanese found fewer openings, but they fought on with unshakable ferocity. By midnight, the counterattacks had consumed much of the remaining Japanese strength, but scattered groups still harassed marine lines. Some attempted to swim through the lagoon, hoping to flank American positions under cover of darkness. Others launched final suicidal rushes at tanks and machine gun nests, detonating themselves in blinding explosions. Marines described the horror of hearing screams, followed by sudden silence as comrades were torn apart. Flamethrowers lit up the night again and again, bathing trenches in fire to end the assaults. Each act of defiance cost the defenders lives they could not afford, but they never relented. By dawn, the defenders had been reduced to broken remnants, scattered in small pockets of resistance. The Marines, though battered, had survived the longest night of their lives. For them, sunrise was not only a new day, it was a reprieve from hell. Betio had become the grave of Shibasaki's men, but at a dreadful cost. When light returned, Marines surveyed a battlefield transformed into a vision of horror. The sand was littered with bodies, both Japanese and American, tangled together in grotesque embraces of death. Bayonets still protruded from corpses, rifles clutched in lifeless hands, grenades frozen in fingers. The scale of the carnage defied imagination, the night having claimed hundreds of lives in just a few hours. Marines gathered the wounded, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical after sleepless struggle. Officers counted casualties with grim faces, knowing the price of holding the line had been staggering. Yet there was also relief, for the Japanese had spent themselves in futile fury. The Marines had endured the storm and lived to continue the fight. The night of terror became legend, a warning of the ferocity awaiting them on every island yet to come. At Tarawa, courage and horror had walked side by side in the darkness. The morning of November 21st brought a new determination to the Marines clinging to the blood-soaked sand of Red Beach. After a night of terror, reinforcements began to arrive, bringing fresh strength and vital supplies across the reef. Tanks, stalled the previous day by low tides and enemy fire, finally rumbled ashore under covering barrages. Their tracks carved deep grooves into the coral sand as Marines cheered the sight of steel joining flesh. Engineers worked frantically to clear obstacles, blowing gaps in wrecked defenses with satchel charges and dynamite. The thundering support of naval guns roared again, smashing suspected bunkers before the next assault began. Smoke from the bombardment drifted inland, cloaking the battlefield in a shifting haze that hid movements on both sides. Marines crouched low, weapons ready, waiting for the order to push forward into the maelstrom. On this second day, the tide was no longer against them, it was beginning to turn. The long-awaited breakthrough at Red Beach was about to unfold. Armored support arrived in the form of M4 Sherman tanks, their heavy guns a decisive factor against stubborn Japanese bunkers. Crews guided their steel beasts cautiously across the uneven terrain, wary of hidden mines and trenches. Marines clung to their sides, using the vehicles as moving shields against machine gun fire. When the tanks fired, the recoil shook the earth, shells smashing through coconut log fortifications with devastating force. The Japanese responded with armor-piercing shells and desperate close-in attacks, but the tanks pressed forward relentlessly. Flamethrower teams moved in behind them, pouring fire into pillboxes and silencing defenders in bursts of searing heat. The soundscape was one of thunder and screams, a violent chorus echoing across the narrow island. Each advance was measured in yards, every inch won at the cost of blood and steel. But unlike the chaos of the first landings, coordination now gave the Marines momentum. Red Beach, once a killing ground, was transforming into a springboard for victory. Coordinated assaults unfolded with precision as infantry and armor worked in tandem across the broken landscape. Rifle squads advanced behind the cover of tanks, firing in volleys to pin defenders in bunkers. Engineers followed, tossing grenades through firing slits before blasting openings with explosives. Once gaps were made, flamethrower teams unleashed streams of fire, clearing nests that had withstood bombardment. The Marines had learned from the previous day's carnage that isolated charges were suicidal. Instead, they attacked in coordinated waves, each element reinforcing the other. Communication between units, though often difficult, improved through the use of hand signals and shouted commands. Naval gunfire timed its strikes with Marine advances, suppressing defenders just long enough for breakthroughs. The battlefield became a brutal but calculated machine of destruction, slowly dismantling the Japanese stronghold. For the first time since the landings began, the Marines could feel momentum shifting in their favor. Japanese defenders, though fanatical, now faced the crushing weight of combined arms they could not withstand. Their bunkers, once impregnable, crumbled under the concentrated fire of tanks and naval guns. Machine gun nests that had mowed down Marines the day before were silenced one by one. Mortar pits, once carefully hidden, were uncovered by forward scouts and destroyed with pinpoint fire. The loss of Rear Admiral Shibasaki had already fractured their chain of command, leaving units to fight independently. Still, each bunker became a last stand, defenders fighting with rifles, grenades, and bayonets until engulfed in fire. Many chose suicide rather than capture, detonating grenades against their chests inside collapsing fortifications. The Japanese had vowed to kill as many Marines as possible, even in their final moments. Yet the weight of American firepower was unstoppable, grinding down resistance bunker by bunker. The balance of the battle had begun to tilt inexorably toward the invaders. Marines advancing inland encountered scenes of unimaginable destruction as they fought through ruined strongpoints. Corpses of Japanese soldiers lay charred in bunkers, their weapons still clutched in burned hands. Sand was churned into a dark mixture of blood, oil, and smoke, creating a nightmarish terrain of death. Survivors described the smell of burning flesh as unforgettable, lingering long after the flames had gone. Engineers crawled across this inferno, laying charges against fortified walls as bullets snapped overhead. One Marine later wrote, "Every bunker was a tomb, and every step forward felt like stepping over ghosts." The psychological strain was immense, yet discipline and training kept the men moving forward. Casualties mounted with each assault, but no one dared falter, knowing hesitation meant death. Across Red Beach, the Marines pressed on, grimly determined to finish what they had begun. Tarawa was a crucible, and they were being forged in its fire. As the tide of battle shifted, leadership played a decisive role in holding the fragile gains. Officers shouted above the din, rallying shattered platoons to reform and push forward. Non-commissioned officers guided small units through the labyrinth of wreckage, leading by example under relentless fire. Company commanders coordinated tank movements, ensuring steel and flesh worked together instead of apart. Radios crackled with half-heard orders, often drowned out by explosions, forcing improvisation at the front lines. Marines followed hand signals, flares, and instinct, adapting to chaos with remarkable resilience. Despite exhaustion and mounting casualties, discipline remained intact, the chain of command refusing to break. Officers carried pistols and rifles alike, often leading charges when hesitation threatened progress. Leadership was not distant. It was shoulder to shoulder with the men, bleeding and fighting with them. This unity of command and courage gave the Marines their edge, turning the tide where brute force alone had failed. On Red Beach, resolve became their greatest weapon. By afternoon, breakthroughs were achieved across key sectors of the Japanese defensive line. Tanks rolled deeper into the island, crushing barricades and scattering defenders with relentless fire. Marines fanned out, expanding their foothold beyond the narrow strip where they had nearly been annihilated. Supply lines opened at last, with more ammunition, water, and medical aid reaching the front. Corpsmen tended to the wounded under makeshift shelters, their hands slick with blood as they fought to save lives. Dead comrades were pulled from the sand and laid in rows, a grim reminder of the cost of each advance. Yet morale surged, for the Marines knew they had survived the worst, and now carried the battle forward. Japanese resistance remained fierce, but the aura of invincibility around their fortifications was breaking. The second day of combat had given the Marines something the first day had nearly destroyed: confidence. Red Beach was no longer a place of slaughter alone. It was the path to victory. As the sun set on the second day of battle, the Marines held more ground than ever before. Their lines were deeper, stronger, and fortified by tanks that anchored positions against counterattack. Exhausted men dug in again, preparing for another night of uncertainty, but with a sense of momentum. The beach, once choked with wrecked landing craft and corpses, now echoed with the clang of tools and the rumble of tanks. Victory was not yet complete, but the breakthrough at Red Beach had changed the course of the fight. The Japanese, though still defiant, had lost their cohesion, their strength crumbling with each passing hour. Marines sat in foxholes beside tanks, sharing cigarettes and water as they braced for the night ahead. Above them, stars flickered faintly through drifting smoke, silent witnesses to the carnage below. The Battle of Tarawa was far from over, but on this day the tide had turned. Red Beach had been won, inch by bloody inch. By the third day of battle, Betio was a shattered husk, its palm trees blasted into stumps, and its bunkers smoking ruins. Yet within that devastation, clusters of Japanese defenders still clung to life, determined to sell each breath dearly. The Marines advanced cautiously, knowing every crater and ruin could conceal men waiting to spring in defiance. Tanks rumbled ahead, belching fire into suspected strongpoints, while riflemen fanned out through the wreckage. Engineers with flamethrowers crawled close to concrete shelters, igniting bursts that filled the air with choking smoke. From deep within the ruins, the Japanese answered with grenades hurled from hidden holes. Each step forward became a duel between technology and fanaticism, between survival and death. The Marines knew victory was at hand, but the final hours would prove just as brutal as the first. Every inch of Betio had to be won with violence. The island's conquest came not in sweeping maneuvers, but in a slow grinding of flesh against steel. The last organized resistance centered around fortified pockets scattered across the island's western end. These strongholds were often nothing more than collapsed bunkers where survivors clung to life in airless dark. Inside, men crouched with rifles, swords, and grenades, their faces smeared with soot and sweat. Refusing surrender, they waited silently until Marines approached, then erupted in sudden violence. Flamethrower teams moved methodically, torching one bunker after another, their fuel tanks hissing with each burst of fire. The infernos consumed oxygen, suffocating defenders, or driving them screaming into waiting gunfire. Satchel charges detonated with concussive force, reducing log walls and concrete shelters to dust. The advance was relentless, stripping the island of its last defenses one by one. Marines spoke of the eerie silence after each assault, broken only by the crackle of flames. Betio's final defenders were being annihilated, bunker by bunker, trench by trench. Suicidal charges marked the end for many Japanese soldiers, their death cries echoing across the ruined island. At dusk, survivors leapt from trenches and rubble, charging into marine lines with bayonets fixed. Some carried explosives tied to their bodies, detonating themselves in blinding flashes among startled riflemen. Marines responded with disciplined volleys, mowing down attackers who seemed to seek only glorious death. Yet in the chaos, some Japanese fighters reached the foxholes, where combat devolved into primal struggle. Rifle butts, knives and bare hands became weapons as men fought at arm's length. Corpsmen darted through the madness, dragging the wounded back while dodging grenades. The beach that had once been a killing field at the reef was now a killing ground inland. Each suicidal rush only hastened the destruction of the defenders, but not before taking more Marines with them. Tarawa's final hours were as savage as its beginning. For the Marines, exhaustion weighed heavily as they pressed the final attacks. 3 days of continuous combat had drained them, their faces gaunt with hunger and sleeplessness. Yet orders came to finish the job, and they obeyed with grim determination. Units advanced in staggered lines, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning every shadow. Tanks fired point-blank at rubble heaps, their guns recoiling with thunderous blasts that echoed over the atoll. Engineers carried more charges, crawling through smoke to place explosives against stubborn strongholds. When explosions subsided, silence fell, broken only by groans or sudden shots as survivors made last stands. The psychological toll was immense, knowing the enemy would never surrender, only die fighting. But the Marines pushed forward, their discipline and cohesion holding against fatigue. The end of the battle was near, but not without exacting its final toll. By the fourth morning, organized Japanese resistance had collapsed, replaced by scattered individuals fighting in isolation. Marines swept the island systematically, clearing trenches and dugouts with grenades and bayonets. Each encounter carried the risk of sudden violence, as enemies feigned death before lunging at unsuspecting men. Corpses lay in heaps across the sand, some burned beyond recognition, others riddled with bullet holes. Amid the carnage, a handful of Japanese attempted to escape, swimming desperately toward the lagoon. Machine guns cut them down in the water, their bodies floating as grim reminders of futility. Prisoners were rare, their faces blank with shock, often wounded beyond recovery. Most chose suicide, detonating grenades within their shelters, rather than face captivity. The Marines, hardened by days of slaughter, gave little mercy to those who resisted. Betio had been secured, but at a cost measured in blood. In total, nearly all of the 4,500 Japanese defenders were killed, their bodies strewn across the island. Only a few dozen were captured alive, many too wounded to resist. The sheer scale of destruction shocked even the Marines, who had witnessed battle on Guadalcanal. Never before had they seen an enemy fight with such utter disregard for life. For every Marine stepped forward, dozens of Japanese had fought and died to prevent it. Yet the defenders' fanaticism had proven futile against overwhelming firepower and relentless assaults. The price for America was also staggering, with over 1,000 Marines killed and nearly 2,300 wounded. These casualties, condensed into just 76 hours, revealed the true horror of atoll warfare. Tarawa was secured, but its conquest left scars that would never fully heal. Victory had come, but at a cost few had anticipated. As Marines raised the stars and stripes over the battered ruins of Betio, a strange silence fell across the island. The guns ceased, the smoke cleared, and the stench of death lingered in the still air. Men slumped where they stood, too exhausted to cheer, their faces haunted by what they had endured. Corpsmen tended to the last of the wounded, while engineers searched bunkers for survivors or hidden threats. Burial details began their grim work, laying comrades in neat rows under the tropical sun. War correspondents walked the battlefield, stunned by the carnage they would soon describe to the American public. For the Japanese there would be no stories told, only silence and ash. The island had been annihilated as thoroughly as its defenders. Yet in that devastation, the Marines had secured a hard-won foothold in the Central Pacific. Tarawa was theirs, but it had been paid for with blood. The securing of Betio marked the end of the Battle of Tarawa, a fight lasting just 3 days yet echoing for decades. For the Marines it was proof that the doctrine of amphibious assault could work, though at staggering cost. For the Japanese it was validation of their defensive methods, which inflicted carnage even in defeat. The atoll itself, once a paradise of palms and reefs, had become a charnel house of war. Every bunker, trench, and coconut log had been tested in fire and blood. Survivors of the battle carried its memory for the rest of their lives, haunted by the screams and sights of Tarawa. The island was secured, but its story was only beginning, as its lessons would shape every battle to come. In the Pacific, there would be more Betios, more beaches, and more blood. Tarawa was secured, but the war marched ever forward. Its place in history was written in the sand, in fire and in death. When the last shots faded across Betio, silence revealed a landscape transformed into a graveyard. The sand, once white, was darkened by blood, oil, and fire, bearing the scars of 3 days of slaughter. Marines walked among the wreckage in disbelief, their rifles still in hand, though the enemy had ceased to resist. The sheer number of bodies defied comprehension, each trench and bunker a tomb of charred or mangled remains. Japanese corpses sprawled across the battlefield, their headbands still tied, their bayonets fixed even in death. For every corpse there was a story of defiance, a final act of loyalty to Shibasaki's vow. The Marines too lay in rows, covered with ponchos or blankets, their faces hidden from the tropical sun. More than 1,000 American lives had been extinguished in less than 80 hours. Survivors too exhausted to weep carried their fallen comrades toward makeshift cemeteries. Tarawa had been won, but at a cost too high to celebrate. Casualty counts came slowly, delayed by the sheer chaos of the battlefield and the need to secure the island fully. Officers moved through the ruins, tallying the losses with grim efficiency, knowing families back home awaited news. The numbers grew staggering, nearly 4,500 Japanese defenders annihilated, almost to the last man. Barely a few dozen were taken prisoner, most of them wounded too severely to resist capture. For the Marines, 1,000 dead and over 2,300 wounded painted a picture of brutal attrition. These losses were unprecedented for a single atoll, shocking military planners who had underestimated Japanese resolve. War correspondents recorded the figures, preparing reports that would horrify the American public. The arithmetic of Tarawa revealed a new reality of Pacific warfare. Every mile of sand would be bought with blood. The Marines had learned that victory would not be measured in ground alone, but in the lives spent to seize it. Counting the dead became the final act of battle. The task of burial fell to exhausted Marines, men who had fought alongside the fallen hours earlier. digging graves in the blazing sun. They worked in silence, the sound of shovels mingling with the distant surf. Some wept quietly, others muttered prayers, and some worked with hardened faces, suppressing emotion to finish the job. The bodies of comrades were laid to rest in long rows, rifles and helmets marking each grave. Chaplains spoke hurried words over the fallen, voices breaking as they blessed men they had just seen alive. For many Marines, burying friends was harder than fighting, the finality of loss, sinking deeper than gunfire. Japanese bodies were also collected, often in mass graves, their identities lost in the anonymity of war. Civilians, women and children caught in the crossfire were discovered among the ruins, their deaths uncounted in official reports. The island had become a cemetery, where friend and foe alike lay together in the sand. Death was Tarawa's only impartial conqueror. The Japanese defenders, dead almost to the last man, left behind a grim testament to their resolve. Their bodies littered every bunker, trench, and shattered pillbox, testifying to their refusal to surrender. Marines respected their courage, even as they cursed the ferocity that had cost so many American lives. Some defenders had died clutching grenades, others with bayonets still in their hands, their faces frozen in expressions of fury. Their last letters and diaries, recovered from pockets and shelters, revealed thoughts of family, emperor, and duty to the Americans. These writings were haunting reminders of shared humanity buried beneath war's brutality. Yet in the eyes of Japanese command, these men had fulfilled their purpose, buying time with blood. For the survivors of Tarawa, such fanaticism was both terrifying and strangely admirable. The battlefield itself seemed to echo with their vow. Death before dishonor. Tarawa became synonymous with resistance, that ended only in annihilation. Civilian suffering, though smaller in scale, added another layer of tragedy to the battle's aftermath. The Gilbertese laborers, forced by the Japanese to build fortifications, were trapped in the fighting. Some were killed by bombardment, others by crossfire, their homes and livelihoods destroyed in the carnage. Survivors emerged dazed from shelters, blinking into the daylight of an island they barely recognized. Marines offered them rations and water, small acts of humanity amid the devastation. Their faces bore the exhaustion of years under occupation, now compounded by the horror of battle. Many had lost family members, their grief overshadowed by the sheer scale of destruction around them. These civilians became silent witnesses to the clash of empires, their suffering largely absent from headlines. For them, Tarawa's victory brought not liberation but survival in ruins. The civilian toll was a forgotten chapter of the battle's cost. The battlefield itself seemed alive with reminders of the dead, as if the island resisted the living. The stench of rotting flesh carried across the lagoon, mixed with smoke and salt air. Flies swarmed over corpses, crawling into wounds and helmets abandoned in the sand. Blood stained the coral reef, where Marines had fallen in shallow water, their bodies recovered days later. Equipment lay scattered across the island, rifles, helmets, packs, each one a silent testament to a life lost. Wrecked tanks and landing craft rusted in the surf, grim monuments to the chaos of the first day. War photographers captured these scenes, their images destined to bring the reality of Tarawa home to America. For those who had survived, the battlefield was both sacred and unbearable, a place of victory and death intertwined. The island itself had become a shrine of sacrifice. Every grain of sand carried the memory of the fallen. Tarawa was not just secured, it was consecrated in blood. Back home, the counting of the dead reached beyond statistics, striking families with devastating force. Telegrams arrived in American towns and cities, bearing news of sons, brothers, and husbands lost on a distant atoll. Mothers wept in kitchens, fathers stood silent on porches, and children asked questions no one could answer. The Marine Corps released casualty figures with sober language, unable to mask the enormity of loss. Newspapers reported Tarawa as a victory, but could not hide the cost in blood. Photographs of rows of crosses on the island shocked a public unprepared for such sacrifice. For many families, Tarawa was the first brutal reminder of how far and how deadly the Pacific War had become. Every number in the casualty list was a face, a life, a future gone forever. The counting of the dead was not only for history, it was for grieving homes across America. Tarawa's shadow stretched across oceans into every corner of the nation. In the end, the aftermath of Tarawa was defined as much by the dead as by the living. More than 1,000 Marines had given their lives, alongside nearly every one of the 4,500 Japanese defenders. Civilians too had perished, their suffering overshadowed by the clash of armies. The island, once a quiet atoll, had become a place of reckoning where war's brutality was laid bare. Counting the dead was not merely arithmetic, it was the measure of sacrifice, futility, and endurance. For the Marines, it was a warning of the battles still to come, each island promising equal or greater bloodshed. For the Japanese, it was proof that even annihilation could serve a strategic purpose. For the civilians, it was a tragedy with no resolution but survival. And for history, it was a lesson written in corpses and coral. At Tarawa, the dead had become the true chroniclers of war. When the first newsreels of Tarawa reached American theaters, audiences were confronted with images unlike anything they had seen before. Grainy black and white footage showed Marines wading through water choked with bodies, advancing under sheets of fire. Cameras captured men crouched behind wrecked landing craft, some collapsing in the surf as bullets tore the lagoon. The soundtracks added grim narration, emphasizing the heroism, but unable to soften the carnage displayed. For the first time, the American public saw war in the Pacific not as a distant campaign, but as an intimate struggle of flesh and blood. Men fell, struggled, and died before the camera lens, their sacrifices etched permanently into collective memory. The footage shocked viewers who had previously been shielded from such graphic portrayals. Some gasped, some wept openly, and some left theaters unable to endure the horror. The war had never seemed so real, nor so costly. Tarawa had crossed a line in how America witnessed its own war. The Marine Corps had wrestled with whether to release such raw footage, fearing its impact on morale. Yet commanders argued that the truth of Tarawa had to be shown, lest the public underestimate the stakes of the Pacific struggle. The decision was a gamble, one that revealed both the bravery and the brutal cost of amphibious warfare. When the reels rolled across the country, newspapers carried editorials debating the ethics of showing American dead. Some called it exploitation, while others praised the honesty, saying the nation deserved to see the truth. Families of Marines watched with trembling hands, sometimes recognizing faces among the fallen on screen. For mothers and fathers, the war was no longer an abstraction of distant maps. It was sons bleeding in sand and surf. The footage became both memorial and warning, its power resonating far beyond the theaters. Tarawa was no longer just a battle, it was now a national reckoning. Audiences in cities and small towns alike sat stunned as images of shattered bunkers and flame-filled trenches appeared before their eyes. Marines dragged wounded comrades from the water, while others carried satchel charges toward enemy strongpoints. Japanese defenders appeared in brief glimpses, fanatics firing to the last, their bodies later strewn across the island. The silence in theaters was heavy, broken only by sharp intakes of breath or quiet sobs. Unlike the triumphal newsreels of earlier campaigns, this film stripped away illusions of easy victory. Every frame carried weight, every death shown was real, every face belonged to a family back home. Even those far from military life felt the gravity, as if the war had crossed their doorstep. Veterans of World War I remarked that even their generation had never seen such stark truth on screen. The shock was deliberate, a reminder that victory in the Pacific demanded unimaginable sacrifice. Tarawa forced America to confront the human cost of its global war. The political impact of Tarawa's footage rippled quickly through Washington and beyond. Senators and congressmen who had long debated military budgets now viewed the reels in private screenings. The sight of American Marines falling in shallow water erased any doubts about the necessity of full-scale mobilization. War planners used the footage to justify greater investment in amphibious craft, better equipment, and more support for the Marine Corps. President Roosevelt himself acknowledged the significance, seeing how the images galvanized national resolve. Public opinion hardened overnight, silencing voices that had questioned the Central Pacific strategy. Where critics once asked why Americans should die for tiny islands, Tarawa answered with images of heroism and necessity. The political will to press forward grew stronger, even as the cost was measured in lives. The footage transformed not only hearts but policies, shaping the very path of the Pacific War. Tarawa's shockwaves reached from theaters into the highest corridors of power. The cultural response was equally profound, with newspapers, radio broadcasts, and church sermons echoing the themes of sacrifice. Newspapers printed still images of Marines clinging to seawalls or sprawled on the beach, their youth and vulnerability unmistakable. Radio commentators spoke with reverence, framing Tarawa as proof of American courage against implacable foes. In churches, ministers preached of duty, sacrifice, and the sanctity of the cause, drawing directly from the images on screen. Communities rallied behind war bond drives, determined to support the men fighting in such terrible conditions. Letters poured into the War Department, expressing grief, anger, and pride in equal measure. Artists and writers began to capture Tarawa's essence, portraying it as a crucible of American spirit. For many, the film served as both horror and inspiration, igniting resolve to see the war through. Culture became a vessel for processing the raw reality of the Pacific struggle. Tarawa had entered the nation's soul, not just its headlines. Among Marines themselves, reactions to the public release were deeply personal and often painful. Survivors who watched the reels saw comrades fall again before their eyes, reliving moments they wished to forget. Some felt pride that their sacrifice was honored, shown honestly without distortion. Others resented the exposure, believing the most intimate moments of death should not be broadcast for strangers. Yet many understood the necessity. America had to know what it asked of its young men. Letters from Marines reflected a mix of emotions, from bitterness to grim acceptance. For those recovering in hospitals, the footage served as proof that their wounds had meaning. For the fallen, it ensured their deaths were not hidden in silence. The honesty of Tarawa's film created a bridge between the battlefield and the home front. It connected those who fought with those who waited, binding them in shared grief and determination. Marines bore the cost, but America shared in the burden. The shock of Tarawa also reshaped how Americans viewed the enemy, intensifying both hatred and respect. The film depicted Japanese soldiers fighting to the last man, their corpses filling trenches and bunkers. Viewers saw not only the cruelty of fanatic resistance, but also the scale of sacrifice demanded by such an enemy. This duality deepened the sense that Japan would never surrender easily, that every island would be another Tarawa. Hatred for the enemy grew sharper, fed by stories of cruelty, but respect also lingered for such relentless determination. For some Americans, this realization was sobering. The Pacific War would be long, bloody, and merciless. The footage reinforced that every battle would test not just weapons but the nation's will to endure. Marines' courage became the mirror image of Japanese fanaticism, both sides locked in struggles to the death. America now understood that victory would not come cheaply or quickly. Tarawa's film taught that lesson better than words ever could. In the end, the shockwaves from Tarawa's newsreels did not weaken America. They steeled it. The public's initial horror transformed into determination, a collective vow that such sacrifice would not be in vain. War bond sales rose, recruitment swelled, and faith in the Marines solidified despite the losses. Tarawa became a symbol both of suffering and of resolve, reminding Americans of the price of victory. The footage ensured that the Pacific War was no longer distant, no longer abstract. It was immediate and personal. Families who had never heard of Betio now spoke the name with reverence and grief. The shock at home bound the nation closer to the war, uniting the home front with the battlefield. America emerged from Tarawa's revelation changed, its illusions stripped away, but its spirit unbroken. The dead of Tarawa had not fallen unseen. Their sacrifice echoed through film, word, and memory. In their deaths, the nation found the resolve to fight on. Tarawa was not only a battlefield, but also a brutal classroom for the US military, rewriting the very rules of amphibious warfare. The shallow coral reefs that stranded Higgins' boats in the lagoon forced commanders to re-evaluate their faith in conventional landing craft. Amphibious doctrine, once confident in the flexibility of tide and design, now bore the scars of miscalculation. Marines who slogged hundreds of yards under fire exposed the dire consequences of poor hydrographic intelligence. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, planners realized tides were as deadly as bullets if ignored. Future operations would demand precise study of reefs, currents, and moon cycles, with reconnaissance elevated to new importance. The disaster at the reef became a catalyst for scientific innovation, spawning the development of specialized tide prediction units. Never again would an invasion hinge so precariously on misunderstood waters. Tarawa taught that geography itself could become an ally or a killer. The lagoon was both battlefield and teacher, its lessons etched in blood. The ordeal of stranded landing craft also revealed the limitations of the Higgins boat, once hailed as the workhorse of amphibious war. Designed for beaches of sand, not coral shelves, the craft's shallow draft proved too little against the reef's jagged teeth. Men forced to leap out in chest-deep water became living targets, their rifles drenched and ammunition ruined. Engineers studying the carnage concluded that amphibious vehicles must not only reach the shore, but also breach obstacles without pause. This realization birthed the rise of the LVT, landing vehicle, tract known as the Amtrak, which proved invaluable in later Pacific battles. Its ability to crawl over reefs and drive straight onto beaches offered Marines the armored lifeline Tarawa had denied them. Logistics officers urged mass production, ensuring future divisions would storm shores with mechanized teeth rather than wooden hulls. Every new invasion plan centered around the LVT as the keystone of assault waves. Tarawa had shown that technology, not bravery alone, could mean survival. Fire support doctrine also came under harsh scrutiny, as the pre-invasion bombardment at Tarawa revealed its shortcomings. Battleships and cruisers had pounded Betio, but their shells were too few, and their bombardment too brief. Japanese bunkers of coconut logs, steel, and reinforced concrete shrugged off the fury, their machine guns still waiting when Marines landed. Commanders acknowledged that the old standard of softening the beach was no longer adequate against such fortifications. The Pacific demanded overwhelming, sustained bombardment, not mere hours but days of calculated destruction. Carrier aircraft, naval gunfire, and artillery had to be fused into a single orchestration of devastation. By the time of Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, the firestorm before landings would last longer and strike deeper. The Marines who died at Tarawa became the grim proof of underestimation. Every fortress from the Gilberts onward would be battered more thoroughly before the first boots touched sand. Tarawa forced firepower to evolve from spectacle to science. Logistical planning, once treated as a secondary concern, was thrust into the heart of operational doctrine after Tarawa. Supply ships anchored too far out, forcing wounded men and ammunition alike to struggle across deadly water. Communication lines faltered in the chaos, leaving battalion commanders cut off from their regiments. Engineers learned that beaches needed immediate organization, supply dumps, casualty stations, and command posts erected under fire. The Marine suffering showed that without logistics, bravery bled out into futility. In later campaigns, Seabees and beachmasters would drill endlessly on how to turn chaos into structure within hours of landing. Amphibious doctrine expanded to treat beaches not just as gateways, but as arteries of survival. Radios, landing schedules, and unloading timetables became as critical as rifles and grenades. Tarawa forced the Navy and Marines to recognize logistics as the skeleton that held flesh and blood together. In the Pacific, battles would now be fought with clipboards as well as carbines. Leadership also absorbed hard lessons, for Tarawa exposed the cost of rigid planning in the face of fluid realities. Commanders had expected a swift conquest of Betio, dismissing the island as a two-day job. Instead, the reef, the bunkers, and the defenders demanded 3 days of slaughter to secure the atoll. Senior officers now grasped the importance of flexibility, of improvising when plans dissolved in smoke. Unit commanders were empowered in later campaigns to adapt, call in fire, and shift landings on their own initiative. Tarawa's blood taught generals to trust the instincts of lieutenants crouching in sand rather than clinging to blueprints offshore. The cult of centralized perfection gave way to decentralized grit, where initiative meant life or death. Marines who charged bunkers with flamethrowers and satchel charges became models for future tactics. Doctrine embraced small unit aggressiveness as the core of island warfare. The chain of command itself had been rewritten by the reef and the sand. The human element, too, was woven into the lessons, for morale under such carnage revealed the spirit required to endure. Marines who waded into fire without hesitation became testaments to training and esprit de corps. Yet officers saw how exhaustion, dehydration, and shattered nerves could paralyze even the bravest men. Medical services were restructured to treat not only wounds but also the invisible fractures of shock and fatigue. Chaplains, doctors, and corpsmen were recognized as anchors of survival, binding shattered units together in chaos. Training shifted toward conditioning men for the unimaginable, preparing them to fight not just with bodies but with resilience. Tarawa showed that victory belonged to the soldier who could keep moving forward, even across fields of corpses. Future invasions demanded not only better weapons but also stronger minds and spirits. The Marines who endured Betio became the teachers of this truth. Their survival was the doctrine's most human amendment. Intelligence gathering, once patchwork, was elevated to an art after the catastrophe of Betio's reefs and bunkers. Reconnaissance planes had skimmed the lagoon, but their photographs had failed to capture the depth of Japanese defenses. Prisoners and locals had offered fragments of knowledge, yet nothing comprehensive enough to avert disaster. After Tarawa, amphibious doctrine decreed that every reef, every tide chart, and every bunker must be studied before the first wave. Underwater demolition teams, the forerunners of modern Navy SEALs, were created to probe beaches and clear obstacles. Hydrographic surveys became missions of war, as vital as bombing runs or fleet maneuvers. A single misread tide table had cost hundreds of lives, and never again would that error be repeated. Intelligence became the unseen weapon, wielded with precision before boots touched sand. Tarawa had proved ignorance was as lethal as enemy fire. From then on, knowledge itself became armor for the Marines. Above all, Tarawa's greatest lesson was that amphibious war was no longer an experiment, but a crucible of survival. The cost of Betio forced the United States to innovate, adapt, and harden its doctrine in ways no peacetime exercise could teach. Marines and sailors carried these lessons forward, turning Tarawa's agony into preparation for the far greater horrors of Peleli, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Every landing thereafter bore the imprint of Betio: longer bombardments, better vehicles, sharper intelligence, and disciplined logistics. Tarawa's dead had become silent instructors, their sacrifice ensuring fewer comrades would fall in the same traps. The Pacific theater itself was reshaped, as doctrine evolved to meet the unforgiving demands of coral, jungle, and fanatical resistance. Tarawa was a blood baptism, marking the maturity of amphibious warfare. It transformed not only how America fought, but also how it thought about war itself. In 3 days of hell, an entire doctrine was reforged in fire. The Battle of Tarawa was more than a 3-day struggle over a speck of coral in the Gilbert Islands. It became a crucible that defined the Marine Corps for generations. The images of Marines wading through chest-deep water under withering fire seared themselves into the American consciousness. Newsreels showing rows of bodies floating in the lagoon shocked a home front that had been shielded from the war's raw brutality. Yet those same scenes also cemented the idea of the Marines as warriors willing to pay any price for victory. For the Corps, Tarawa became a bloody baptism, its cost-transforming reputation into legend. The sacrifice of the 2nd Marine Division echoed through training grounds, inspiring future recruits. Betio entered marine law, a word whispered with reverence and fear in equal measure. Veterans who survived carried scars that made them symbols of resilience. The atoll's coral sands had turned into a monument long before stone or bronze marked it. Tarawa became a place where identity was forged in blood. Strategically, the conquest of Tarawa opened the gates of the Central Pacific, validating the bold island-hopping strategy championed by Admiral Chester Nimitz. With Betio's airfield secured, long-range bombers could strike deeper into the Marshalls, undermining Japan's outer defensive ring. This success provided proof that America could pierce fortified islands rather than bypass them all. Critics of the Central Pacific Drive, who favored a southern advance through the Solomons, were forced to acknowledge the operation's brutal efficiency. The blood cost was staggering, but the lesson was clear: heavily defended islands could be taken, albeit at a terrible price. For the Japanese, Tarawa's fall shattered the illusion of an impenetrable fortress system. The empire's planners realized that even the strongest coral bastions could crumble under Allied persistence and firepower. Tarawa thus reshaped the geography of the war, placing the Marshalls, the Carolines, and eventually the Marianas in America's sights. The road to Saipan and Iwo Jima began with the reef at Betio. Tarawa was the key that unlocked the next phase of the Pacific campaign. On the home front, the reaction to Tarawa's carnage was immediate and visceral, as newspapers and newsreels brought the horror into American living rooms. For the first time, citizens saw unfiltered images of their sons lying lifeless in tropical waters. The War Department debated whether such grim honesty would demoralize the public, yet the opposite proved true. Instead of weakening resolve, the images hardened it, igniting outrage against Japan and steeling determination for the battles ahead. Families wept, but they also demanded that their sons' sacrifices not be in vain. Recruitment offices swelled with volunteers inspired by the Marines' tenacity. Tarawa's truth carried across the nation like a torch, illuminating both the price of war and the necessity of finishing it. It marked a turning point in wartime communication, where sanitized reports gave way to brutal honesty. For many Americans, the Pacific War ceased to be distant and abstract. After Tarawa, the home front felt the war's weight as if it rested on their own shoulders. The lagoon's blood had spread into the conscience of a nation. For Japan, Tarawa's legacy was one of grim determination mixed with fatal miscalculation. The defenders had fought to the last man, fulfilling Bushido's call to die rather than surrender. Rear Admiral Shibasaki's prediction that it would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Betio had been disproven in 76 hours. Yet instead of shaking Japanese faith in their defensive doctrine, Tarawa encouraged an even deeper commitment to suicidal resistance. Tokyo broadcast the defenders' sacrifice as heroic proof of the emperor's will. Future garrisons at Peleliu, Saipan, and Iwo Jima adopted the same doctrine of fanatical last stands. In this sense, Tarawa was not only a defeat, but also a grim rehearsal for the horrors to come. The blood price paid by the Marines was a harbinger of even greater tolls that awaited in the Central Pacific. For Japan, Betio was a loss in territory, but a reinforcement of a strategy of death. The atoll became both a grave and a warning, one the Allies could not ignore. Within the Marine Corps, Tarawa became a reference point for innovation and pride. The doctrine of amphibious assault was rewritten line by line, with every mistake carved into memory. Training shifted to emphasize tide studies, reconnaissance, and flexible leadership under fire. Engineers perfected flamethrowers and demolitions to counter bunkers that had cost so many lives. The LVT became a symbol of salvation, its tracks grinding over reefs where Higgins' boats had faltered. At Quantico and Paris Island, recruits studied Tarawa not as history but as scripture. The ethos of every marine or rifleman was tested and proven in the sand and surf of Betio. The Corps' modern identity, fierce, adaptable, and unyielding, was crystallized in that bloody atoll. Veterans of Tarawa became living testaments, their scars carried like banners of honor. To wear the eagle, globe, and anchor after 1943 was to inherit the legacy of Betio's lagoon. Tarawa became not just a battle, but a rite of passage etched into marine tradition. Historians, too, have debated Tarawa's meaning, weighing its high cost against its strategic gain. Some argue that bypassing the Gilberts might have saved lives, pointing to later leapfrogging campaigns that isolated islands instead of storming them. Others insist Tarawa was essential, a proof of concept that tested doctrine before the far larger invasions ahead. Its lessons in firepower, logistics, and amphibious craft could not have been learned in theory alone.